On Christmas Eve, my daughter's father-in-law dumped a boiling cup of Irish coffee right down the front of her dress. Her husband, my son-in-law, didn't even blink. He just let out a nasty little laugh and said, "Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll finally teach her some high society manners." I could feel my fingers digging so hard into the edges of the mahogany chair that the wood literally groaned under my knuckles. The entire dining room went dead silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see this scrawny old man in a cheap suit bow his head and swallow the humiliation. They expected me to beg for mercy or break down in tears right then and there. Instead, I stood up and walked out without saying a single word. I stepped out into the freezing snow, climbed into my rusty old Chevy Silverado, and picked up an encrypted satellite phone. I dialed one number. Those people had absolutely no idea that the old man they just humiliated and threw out of their mansion was the secret lender holding the massive mezzanine debt on their signature Manhattan skyscraper. They had no clue what kind of monster they had just woken up. My name is Arthur Vance, and I am 70 years old. To the rest of the world, I'm just a retired mechanic, living off a modest pension in a run-down farmhouse in upstate New York. I drive a beat-up truck that feels like it could break down at any moment, and I wear outdated corduroy jackets. But that's all just a mask, a disguise I painstakingly built for myself after my wife, Martha, passed away. In my past life, I was the premier cleanup man and forensic auditor for Wall Street's biggest private equity firms and multinational conglomerates. I handled the kind of toxic financial disasters that even the federal government refused to touch. The fortune I accumulated is a number these self-proclaimed high society elites couldn't even begin to comprehend. But I had promised Martha I would live a quiet life. I told her I would put down the scalpel for good. Tonight, though, the Sterling family forced me to pick it back up. The air inside the Sterling family's Hamptons estate was absolutely suffocating. It wasn't the heat from the grand fireplace. It was the suffocating weight of their judgment. This was my daughter Clara's first Christmas since marrying Julian Sterling. I had been against the marriage from day one, but I love my daughter, so I kept my mouth shut. The Sterlings are textbook New York old money. They have a family crest on their front door and portraits of ancestors on the walls. Ancestors who probably built their fortune by exploiting working-class people exactly like me. And tonight, they were dead set on putting me in my place. They sat me at the absolute far end of the long dining table, completely surrounded by a sea of custom tuxedos and priceless jewelry. I could hear their blatant whispers all night. Julian's aunt, a woman with way too much Botox and zero actual class, leaned over and loudly whispered to the person next to her, saying that I smelled like motor oil. She wondered out loud why I couldn't have at least rented a decent tuxedo for a formal dinner. I just ignored her and kept my eyes on my plate. I learned a long time ago that lions don't care about the opinions of sheep. But what I couldn't stand was the way they looked at Clara. My daughter is beautiful, brilliant, and graduated top of her Ivy League architecture class. She's currently the lead designer at the Sterling firm, but in this house they treated her like a maid who could be replaced at any second. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table. He's 68, with perfectly slick-back hair and icy gray-blue eyes that always look like they're calculating a profit margin. He held a carving knife in his hand like a royal scepter as he looked down at the beef Wellington Clara had spent all day preparing. It was Martha's secret recipe. The rich scent of pastry and butter filled the entire room, but Richard's face showed nothing but disgust. He asked if this was what people like us called a holiday meal, his voice echoing off the crystal wine glasses. Clara forced a nervous smile, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her napkin, explaining that it was prime Wagyu and that she had aged the mushroom sauce exactly the way her mother used to. Richard poked at the meat with his fork, but didn't actually eat it, treating it like roadkill. He said it looked dry and asked if she bought the frozen dough from a budget discount supermarket. A wave of polite snickering broke out across the table. Julian sat right next to his father, swirling his Macallan whiskey, and chimed in with a smirk. He told his dad not to be too hard on her, saying that Clara grew up poor, so she just loved to save money, and old habits die hard. He looked at Clara with this mocking grin. He was trampling all over her upbringing and the life I had provided for her. I could feel the muscles in my jaw tightening. I stared directly at Julian, the man who had stood at an altar and sworn to protect her, now leading the charge to tear her down. Clara's face turned bright red as she tried to hold on to her dignity, telling Julian that she had carefully hand-picked the ingredients at Whole Foods and that it was a tradition. Richard cut her off with a sneer, asking whose tradition she meant, the tradition of people who eat sandwiches in auto repair shops. He told her that they have standards in his house, and they don't eat cheap garbage. That was the breaking point. He didn't use an outright curse word, but that single word hung in the air, incredibly ugly. Garbage? He was talking about us? He was talking about me. Clara slammed her fork and knife down, the silver clattering loudly against the porcelain plate. She told Richard that he was being unfair, that she had poured her heart into the dinner, and if he didn't like it, he didn't have to eat it. But he had no right to insult her family. The entire room went dead silent. Nobody ever talked back to Richard Sterling, let alone a daughter-in-law from a lower social class. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry purple. He slowly stood up and picked up the freshly poured, steaming cup of Irish coffee in front of him. He looked at the mug, then looked directly at my daughter. He lowered his voice to a dangerous, threatening register, asking who she thought she was to talk back to him in his own home. He asked if she thought his son was stupid enough to make her an actual equal by marrying her, telling her she was nothing but a lucky, blue-collar nobody who needed a reminder of where she belonged. It happened in an instant. It felt like slow motion as I watched his wrist flip. The dark brown, scalding liquid flew through the air, hitting Clara right in the face and chest. The coffee soaked her white silk blouse and dripped down her chin. Clara gasped, freezing completely in place, her eyes wide with pure shock and pain. She was burning, but she sat there paralyzed, unable to move. After a second of utter silence, a chuckle broke the tension. It was Julian. My son-in-law actually laughed and patted his father on the back, wiping a tear from his eye. He said she looked like a drowned rat and hoped it would teach her some upper-class manners so she would learn to shut up and listen to her elders. The rest of the family joined right in. The aunt laughed, the cousins laughed. It was a chorus of pure cruelty. I felt the monster inside me wake up, the side of me I had buried deep underground the moment I married Martha, the side that knew exactly how to completely destroy a person's life in 10 seconds flat. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard that the wood grain started to split and crack under my fingertips. I wanted to leap across the table, grab Richard by his silk tie, and slam his face into the mashed potatoes. I wanted to shatter Julian's laughing jaw, but I didn't, because violence would just prove them right. Violence would make me the uncultured savage they already thought I was, and I possessed a weapon that was infinitely more lethal than my fists. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The laughter died down, and everyone turned to look at me. Richard wiped his hands with a napkin, staring at me with absolute contempt. He ordered me to sit down or get out, saying he didn't even know why they invited me since I dragged down the quality of the entire dinner. He told me I looked like a beggar. I walked over to Clara, pulled a handkerchief from my pocket, and gently wiped the coffee from her face. She was trembling all over, and I could see the shame in her eyes. She wasn't ashamed of herself. She was ashamed that I had to witness this. I told her softly that we were leaving. As Clara started to stand, Julian suddenly grabbed her tightly by the arm. He told her through gritted teeth that she wasn't going anywhere, that she had to clean up the mess first. He pointed at the tablecloth, saying it was imported Italian linen, and told her she wouldn't be sleeping until she hand-washed it. I looked down at Julian's hand on my daughter's arm and locked eyes with him. I told him to let her go. Julian laughed again, but there was a hint of nervousness in it this time. He asked what I was going to do about it, mocking my age and telling me to throw my back out trying. He told me to get out of his house and go back to my broken-down farm so the civilized people could be left alone, giving me a shove. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough. I nodded once, and only once. I turned to Clara and told her I would be back for her very soon, telling her to stay strong. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. Just as I reached the door, I heard Richard call out from behind me, telling me not to steal the silverware on my way out. I walked out into the biting December wind. The air was freezing. My old Chevy truck sat right next to their row of Porsches and Range Rovers, looking completely out of place, just like I did. I climbed inside, the leather seat feeling cold as ice. I sat there listening to the howling wind and snow. My heart rate didn't spike, and my breathing stayed perfectly steady. That's what real, absolute fury feels like. It isn't boiling hot, it's freezing cold, it's absolute zero. I reached under the dashboard and pulled out a small black box. Inside was a phone. It wasn't the smartphone I used for my everyday disguise, but a military-grade encrypted satellite terminal, a remnant of my old life. I dialed a number I hadn't touched in 5 years. It rang exactly once. A woman's voice answered, sharp and professional, simply saying my last name. It was Elena, my former second-in-command, the Wall Street shark, who still managed my hidden empire from behind the scenes. I looked through the windshield at the brightly lit floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling estate. I could see the silhouettes of them moving around the dining room, probably raising a toast to their victory, drinking an even more expensive bottle of wine. "Elena," I said. "I'm here, sir," she answered immediately. "I just saw the alert on your biometric monitor. Your heart rate spiked a second ago. Are you in danger?" "No," I told her, "but someone else is. I need you to authorize the Omega Protocol." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. Elena knew exactly what that meant. The Omega Protocol was our nuclear financial option. "Sir," her voice dropped an octave, "the Omega Protocol was built for hostile takeovers against hostile state-level oligarchs. Are you absolutely sure about this?" I looked back up at the grand window of the mansion. Inside, my daughter was being forced down onto her knees to scrub a tablecloth while her husband stood over her, laughing. "I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life," I said. "Target?" Elena asked. "Sterling Architecture and Urban Development Group," I told her, "and every single subsidiary and shell account tied to Richard and Julian Sterling." "Copy that," Elena said. "I'm tapping into the main database right now. Let's see their financials. They are incredibly overleveraged. They have a massive commercial bridge loan coming due next week, and the bank was originally planning to give them an extension. Buy the debt," I commanded. "Every single dime of it. I want the foreclosure rights to their Manhattan headquarters. I want the leases on their company fleets. I want the deed to the very estate I'm looking at right now." "Consider it done," Eleanor replied. "The capital transfer will take about 10 minutes. By the time they finish their dessert, you'll be their landlord." I hung up the phone and placed it back inside the black box. I twisted the key in the ignition, and the truck's engine roared to life, coughing a few times before settling into a steady, heavy idle. I didn't drive away immediately. I just sat there for another minute. They honestly thought I was just some broke, helpless old man. They judged me by my skin, my social class, and the clothes on my back. They poured hot coffee on my daughter because they thought there would be absolutely no consequences. I threw the truck into gear. "Enjoy that wine, Richard," I muttered into the empty cab. "It's the last expensive thing you'll ever taste." As I drove down the estate's winding driveway, I didn't look back. The war had already begun. Unlike them, I don't throw drinks at people. I fight with ink, and my ink was about to turn their entire world into a bloodbath. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at my farmhouse kitchen table, drinking black coffee and watching the sun slowly rise over the snow-covered pine trees. My phone sat on the table like a loaded gun. I was waiting. In a normal world, a sane world, the phone would ring and it would be my son-in-law, Julian. He would apologize, begging for forgiveness for the way his father treated my daughter. He would tell me that after I'd left, he stepped up and protected his wife. That's what a man is supposed to do. That's what a husband does. But I knew Julian Sterling was neither of those things. At 9 o'clock sharp, the phone finally rang. It was Clara. My hand hovered over the screen. I took a deep breath. Right now, I needed to be her father, not the ruthless shadow operator who used to dismantle multinational corporations. I needed to be gentle. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. Silence stretched across the line. Then I heard a quiet sob. "Dad," she choked out, her voice sounding so small and broken, exactly like she did when she scraped her knee as a 6-year-old. "Dad, why did you have to make such a scene last night?" I froze. My grip tightened around my coffee mug. "I made a scene?" I forced down my rising anger, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "Clara, he poured boiling hot coffee right on your face. He humiliated you in front of everyone." I know," she said quickly, actually defending him. "But Richard just has a short fuse. He's been under so much pressure lately with this new acquisition. And honestly, Dad, the steak really was a little dry. I should have checked the oven sooner. I embarrassed Julian. I embarrassed the whole family." I closed my eyes. This wasn't just fear. This was long-term psychological conditioning. This was years of systematic emotional abuse, layered so thick that she couldn't even see the light of day anymore. They had completely warped her reality, convincing her that being abused was somehow her own fault. They had broken my brilliant daughter. "Clara, listen to me," I said firmly. "A man who throws hot liquids at a woman isn't just stressed out. He's a bully. You didn't do a single thing wrong." "Please just stop," she cried out. "You're only making it worse. Julian is furious right now. He said you disrespected his father in his own home. He says you ruined the most important social dinner of the year. Dad, you have to fix this. Please, I can't take the constant screaming anymore." The agony in her voice cut deeper than any knife. She was terrified, not of me, but of what would happen to her if I didn't submit. They were holding her emotionally hostage. "Put him on the phone," I said. "He doesn't want to talk to you. Give him the phone, Clara." I heard some rustling on the other end, followed by a heavy, arrogant sigh. The voice that came through the receiver was dripping with condescension. "Well, look who it is," Julian said. "Man of the hour. I hope you're happy, Arthur. Because of your little stunt last night, my father is talking about cutting us out of the family trust. Do you have any idea how much money you cost me last night?" "I didn't cost you a dime, Julian," I said. "Your father is the one who lacks basic human decency." "Watch your mouth, old man," Julian snapped. "You are skating on incredibly thin ice right now. Clara's hiding in the kitchen, crying her eyes out because of you. Do you want her life to be a living hell? Is that what you want?" "No," I replied. "I want my daughter to be happy." "Then you're going to have to pay for your mistake," Julian said, a distinct note of greed creeping into his tone. "My father is absolutely livid right now, but I think I can handle him. I can convince him to forgive Clara. But I need a gesture, a significant gesture of apology." I stared out the window at the thick woods surrounding my farmhouse. I knew exactly what game he was playing. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked. "Your land upstate," Julian said quickly. "Those 10 acres right by the reservoir. The ones you bought years ago when land values were dirt cheap." I knew the exact plot he was talking about. It was prime real estate now. Developers had been eyeing it for years because it sat directly in the middle of a massive luxury eco-resort the Sterling Group was trying to build. That land was worth at least $3 million. I had originally bought it with the intention of building a house for Clara there one day. "What about that land?" I asked. "Sign it over to me," Julian ordered. "Transfer the deed to Sterling Real Estate. We need it to expand the resort's waterfront property. If you give us the land, my father will see that you're truly remorseful. He'll see that you understand the value of family interests. It's the only way out, Arthur. You want me to hand over a $3 million piece of property because your father threw hot coffee at my daughter?" I asked. "Don't drama queen this," Julian scoffed. "To you it's just a pile of dirt anyway. You live in a shack. What do you need 10 acres for? Look at it as an investment in your daughter's marriage. If you don't do this, my father is going to completely cut off our funding. If we go under, Clara suffers too. Do you really want that on your conscience?" Then came the real threat. And another thing, Arthur, Julian added, dropping his voice low. If you don't fix this, don't expect to ever see us again. Don't expect to see Clara. I won't have toxic people around my family. If you don't sign, you are completely dead to us. Dead to us. The words hung heavily in the air. He was threatening to completely erase me from my daughter's life unless I paid his ransom. He was bartering my right to see my own child. I felt that cold fury wash over me once again, freezing into a solid block in my chest. In my past life, plenty of people had tried to blackmail me. People who were 100 times more dangerous than Julian Sterling. And every single one of those people ended up vanishing into the night. But I couldn't make Julian vanish just yet. Not yet. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to believe I was weak. I forced my breathing to turn shallow and uneven. I made my voice shake. I forced myself to sound like a beaten-down, fragile old man. Please, Julian, I stammered, don't do that. Clara is all I have left. Then do the right thing, Julian said, smelling blood in the water and pressing his advantage. Sign the paperwork. I'll sign it, I said. I'll do it. Just please don't let her cut me out. That land was my retirement fund, but if it saves her marriage, you can have it. Good, Julian said. I knew you'd eventually talk some sense. Come to my father's office at noon sharp with the deed. And Arthur, wear a decent suit this time. You're meeting with business executives, not clearing a clogged drain. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there listening to the dial tone for a long time. Slowly, I lowered the phone back onto the table. The fake trembling in my hands instantly stopped. My spine straightened. The terrified old man was gone, and Arthur Vance was back. They wanted that land. They wanted to strip away the very last thing of value they thought I owned. They truly believed they were robbing a defenseless, lonely old man. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and pushed aside the heavy oak dresser to reveal the hidden wall. Safe. I spun the combination dial. Right, left, right. The heavy steel door popped open with a distinct click. Inside were stacks of cash, gold coins, and files upon files of confidential documents. I pulled out the deed to the lakefront property. It was a completely valid legal document. But at the same exact time, I reached in and pulled out another folder, a thick file labeled Sterling Debt Acquisition. Elena, I said. I'm here, sir, she replied immediately. I just saw the alert on your biometric monitor. Your heart rate spiked a second ago. Are you in danger? No, I told her, but someone else is. I need you to authorize the Omega Protocol. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. Elena knew exactly what that meant. The Omega Protocol was our nuclear financial option. Sir, her voice dropped an octave. The Omega Protocol was built for hostile takeovers against hostile state-level oligarchs. Are you absolutely sure about this? I looked back up at the grand window of the mansion. Inside, my daughter was being forced down onto her knees to scrub a tablecloth while her husband stood over her, laughing. I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life, I said. Target? Elena asked. Sterling Architecture and Urban Development Group, I told her. And every single subsidiary and shell account tied to Richard and Julian Sterling. Copy that, Elena said. I'm tapping into the main database right now. Let's see their financials. They are incredibly overleveraged. They have a massive commercial bridge loan coming due next week, and the bank was originally planning to give them an extension. Buy the debt, I commanded. Every single dime of it. I want the foreclosure rights to their Manhattan headquarters. I want the leases on their company fleets. I want the deed to the very estate I'm looking at right now. Consider it done, Elena replied. The capital transfer will take about 10 minutes. By the time they finish their dessert, you'll be their landlord. I hung up the phone and placed it back inside the black box. I twisted the key in the ignition and the truck's engine roared to life, coughing a few times before settling into a steady, heavy idle. I didn't drive away immediately. I just sat there for another minute. They honestly thought I was just some broke, helpless old man. They judged me by my skin, my social class, and the clothes on my back. They poured hot coffee on my daughter because they thought there would be absolutely no consequences. I threw the truck into gear. "Enjoy that wine, Richard," I muttered into the empty cab. "It's the last expensive thing you'll ever taste." As I drove down the estate's winding driveway, I didn't look back. The war had already begun. Unlike them, I don't throw drinks at people. I fight with ink, and my ink was about to turn their entire world into a bloodbath. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at my farmhouse kitchen table, drinking black coffee and watching the sun slowly rise over the snow-covered pine trees. My phone sat on the table like a loaded gun. I was waiting. In a normal world, a sane world, the phone would ring and it would be my son-in-law, Julian. He would apologize, begging for forgiveness for the way his father treated my daughter. He would tell me that after I left, he stepped up and protected his wife. That's what a man is supposed to do. That's what a husband does. But I knew Julian Sterling was neither of those things. At 9 o'clock sharp, the phone finally rang. It was Clara. My hand hovered over the screen. I took a deep breath. Right now, I needed to be her father, not the ruthless shadow operator who used to dismantle multinational corporations. I needed to be gentle. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. Silence stretched across the line. Then I heard a quiet sob. "Dad," she choked out, her voice sounding so small and broken, exactly like she did when she scraped her knee as a 6-year-old. "Dad, why did you have to make such a scene last night?" I froze. My grip tightened around my coffee mug. I made a scene. I forced down my rising anger, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "Clara, he poured boiling hot coffee right on your face. He humiliated you in front of everyone." I know," she said quickly, actually defending him. "But Richard just has a short fuse. He's been under so much pressure lately with this new acquisition. And honestly, Dad, the steak really was a little dry. I should have checked the oven sooner. I embarrassed Julian. I embarrassed the whole family." I closed my eyes. This wasn't just fear. This was long-term psychological conditioning. This was years of systematic emotional abuse, layered so thick that she couldn't even see the light of day anymore. They had completely warped her reality, convincing her that being abused was somehow her own fault. They had broken my brilliant daughter. "Clara, listen to me," I said firmly. "A man who throws hot liquids at a woman isn't just stressed out. He's a bully. You didn't do a single thing wrong." "Please just stop," she cried out. "You're only making it worse. Julian is furious right now. He said you disrespected his father in his own home. He says you ruined the most important social dinner of the year. Dad, you have to fix this. Please, I can't take the constant screaming anymore." The agony in her voice cut deeper than any knife. She was terrified, not of me, but of what would happen to her if I didn't submit. They were holding her emotionally hostage. "Put him on the phone," I said. "He doesn't want to talk to you." "Give him the phone, Clara." I heard some rustling on the other end, followed by a heavy, arrogant sigh. The voice that came through the receiver was dripping with condescension. "Well, look who it is," Julian said. "Man of the hour. I hope you're happy, Arthur. Because of your little stunt last night, my father is talking about cutting us out of the family trust. Do you have any idea how much money you cost me last night?" "I didn't cost you a dime, Julian," I said. "Your father is the one who lacks basic human decency." "Watch your mouth, old man," Julian snapped. "You are skating on incredibly thin ice right now. Clara is hiding in the kitchen crying her eyes out because of you. Do you want her life to be a living hell? Is that what you want?" "No," I replied. "I want my daughter to be happy." "Then you're going to have to pay for your mistake," Julian said, a distinct note of greed creeping into his tone. "My father is absolutely livid right now, but I think I can handle him. I can convince him to forgive Clara, but I need a gesture, a significant gesture of apology." I stared out the window at the thick woods surrounding my farmhouse. I knew exactly what game he was playing. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked. "Your land upstate," Julian said quickly. "Those 10 acres right by the reservoir. The ones you bought years ago when land values were dirt cheap." I knew the exact plot he was talking about. It was prime real estate now. Developers had been eyeing it for years because it sat directly in the middle of a massive luxury eco-resort the Sterling Group was trying to build. That land was worth at least $3 million. I had originally bought it with the intention of building a house for Clara there one day. What about that land? I asked. Sign it over to me, Julian ordered. Transfer the deed to Sterling Real Estate. We need it to expand the resort's waterfront property. If you give us the land, my father will see that you're truly remorseful. He'll see that you understand the value of family interests. It's the only way out, Arthur. You want me to hand over a $3 million piece of property because your father threw hot coffee at my daughter? I asked. Don't drama queen this, Julian scoffed. To you, it's just a pile of dirt anyway. You live in a shack. What do you need 10 acres for? Look at it as an investment in your daughter's marriage. If you don't do this, my father is going to completely cut off our funding. If we go under, Clara suffers too. Do you really want that on your conscience? Then came the real threat. And another thing, Arthur, Julian added, dropping his voice low. If you don't fix this, don't expect to ever see us again. Don't expect to see Clara. I won't have toxic people around my family. If you don't sign, you are completely dead to us. Dead to us. The words hung heavily in the air. He was threatening to completely erase me from my daughter's life unless I paid his ransom. He was bartering my right to see my own child. I felt that cold fury wash over me once again, freezing into a solid block in my chest. In my past life, plenty of people had tried to blackmail me, people who were 100 times more dangerous than Julian Sterling, and every single one of those people ended up vanishing into the night. But I couldn't make Julian vanish just yet. Not yet. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to believe I was weak. I forced my breathing to turn shallow and uneven. I made my voice shake. I forced myself to sound like a beaten-down, fragile old man. Please, Julian, I stammered, don't do that. Clara's all I have left. Then do the right thing, Julian said, smelling blood in the water and pressing his advantage. Sign the paperwork. I'll sign it, I said. I'll do it. Just please don't let her cut me out. That land was my retirement fund, but if it saves her marriage, you can have it. Good, Julian said. I knew you'd eventually talk some sense. Come to my father's office at noon sharp with the deed. And Arthur, wear a decent suit this time. You're meeting with business executives, not clearing a clogged drain. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there listening to the dial tone for a long time. Slowly, I lowered the phone back onto the table. The fake trembling in my hands instantly stopped. My spine straightened. The terrified old man was gone, and Arthur Vance was back. They wanted that land. They wanted to strip away the very last thing of value they thought I owned. They truly believed they were robbing a defenseless, lonely old man. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and pushed aside the heavy oak dresser to reveal the hidden wall safe. I spun the combination dial, right, left, right. The heavy steel door popped open with a distinct click. Inside were stacks of cash, gold coins, and files upon files of confidential documents. I pulled out the deed to the lakefront property. It was a completely valid legal document. But at the same exact time, I reached in and pulled out another folder, a thick file labeled Sterling Debt Acquisition. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of legal stationery, and began drafting a document. To a trained lawyer, it would look like nothing more than a standard property transfer agreement, complete with perfect legal jargon and watermarks. But hidden inside the fine print was a very specific rider. I wasn't giving them land. I was giving them a Trojan horse. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed Elena again. She picked up on the first ring, greeting me with my last name. I told her I needed a notary, specifically one of our own people, because I was walking straight into the lion's den at noon. Then I asked if the acquisition was complete. It is, she said. We are officially their largest creditor. Everything is set. Good, I replied. Now I'm going to hand them the shovels to dig their own graves. They want the lakefront plot as a peace offering. They're blackmailing you. Her voice sounded cold as ice. Yes, I said, and I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for. I'm signing the land over to them. Sir, that property is worth millions. It's worth more than money right now, I told her. It's bait. I need you to prepare the secondary filings. The exact moment I sign this transfer, I want it to trigger an immediate acceleration clause on their commercial loans. So they think they're getting a free asset, but because of the hidden conflict of interest clauses in their corporate charter, it will actually trigger a default on their primary credit line? Elena asked. Exactly, I said. By accepting such a massive private gift from a known creditor, which is what I am now, they are violating their fiduciary duty. The second they countersign this deed, they go under. Elena let out a rare, low chuckle, noting how vicious it was. They wanted a handout, I said, so I'm giving them one. Have the notary meet me in the lobby of their building, and Elena, get a car ready. I'm not driving the truck today. I hung up and looked in the mirror. I saw an old man with graying hair and tired eyes. It was a perfect disguise that had fooled everyone for a decade. I walked over to the closet and pushed aside the flannel shirts and jeans. Hidden at the very back, sealed inside a plastic garment bag, was a suit. It was a custom charcoal gray Savile Row suit, made from the finest wool. My hand brushed over the fabric. Not yet. I couldn't put on this armor just yet. Instead, I grabbed a well-worn beige jacket with slightly frayed cuffs. I needed to look pathetic. I needed them to feel completely intoxicated by their own success. I needed them to have such a massive sense of superiority that they wouldn't even deign to read the fine print. I walked out of the farmhouse. The air was still freezing. I climbed into my truck and started driving toward the city, toward the glass skyscraper with the name Sterling written in gold letters across the top. They were waiting for a victim. They were waiting for a heartbroken father who was willing to give up everything just for a scrap of fractured family connection. They were going to get exactly what they asked for, but it was going to destroy them entirely. I stopped at a red light and looked down at the manila envelope containing the paperwork on the passenger seat. You want the land, Julian? I said to the empty cab. You can have it, but you really should have learned how to read the fine print. The light turned green and I hit the gas. The hunt was on. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor of the Sterling building was dead silent. The mirrored walls on all sides reflected a tired old man in a cheap jacket, clutching a manila envelope tightly against his chest. I looked at myself, and for a split second, I almost fooled myself. I looked completely defeated, like a soldier who had lost the war before the first shot was even fired. But then I looked closer at my own eyes. That fire was still there, burning cold and steady. I stepped out of the elevator and walked up to the reception desk. The receptionist looked up from her screen and wrinkled her nose in disgust, as if she smelled something rotting. She told me Mr. Sterling was expecting me, not even offering me a seat, and just pointed me straight inside. I walked down a long hallway lined with awards and framed newspaper clippings celebrating Richard Sterling as an industry visionary. But I knew the truth. I knew about the bribes, the cut corners on construction projects, and the contractors he had screwed out of payments. Today I was going to balance all of those ledgers at once. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the executive suite. The office was incredibly spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Richard sat behind a desk large enough to be a small boat, while Julian stood by the window, looking out over the city. Neither of them stood up when I walked in. "You're late," Richard said without even looking up from his computer screen. "We don't run on poor man's time here, Arthur. Time is money." "I'm sorry," I said, bowing my head. The traffic was terrible, and my truck's radiator started boiling over again. Julian turned around with a smug grin on his face. He eyed my jacket and then looked at the envelope in my hands. He looked like a predator, staring down a wounded gazelle, asking if I brought it. "Yes," I replied, holding up the envelope. "The deed is inside. It's already been stamped by a notary." Richard finally looked up. His eyes were cold and dead as he reached a hand out, demanding to see it. I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the carpet, which was thick enough to feel like a sponge. I placed the envelope on his desk. Richard opened it and flipped through the pages quickly. He was looking for the property description, the acreage, and the dollar signs. He didn't look at the transfer terms, and he completely missed the trap. "Looks fine," Richard grunted, closing the folder. "But there's one more thing." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a separate piece of paper. It was only 1 page long. "This is a liability waiver," Richard explained. "It states that you are giving this gift of your own free will, and that you will never seek any future compensation or contact with the Sterling family. It also states that you acknowledge your daughter is only a part of this family through marriage, and that you yourself have no right to ever set foot on this property again." My heart hammered against my ribs. They were trying to permanently ban me from the very land I bought for my daughter. They were trying to completely erase my existence. "I can't sign this," I whispered. "If there are ever grandkids in the future, I just want to be able to visit them." "Sign it or get out," Julian snapped, walking over to stand right next to his father. He told me I had zero leverage, and if I wanted Clara's marriage to work and wanted them to forgive her incompetence, this was the price. I looked at Julian, then at Richard. They were thoroughly enjoying themselves, feeding off my desperation. "Fine," I said, letting my voice shake just the right amount. "I'll sign." Richard smiled, a sharp, shark-like grin. He picked up a pen from his desk. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy black lacquer with gold trim, worth more than my truck. He held it out to me, but just as I reached for it, he opened his fingers. The pen fell, landing on the thick carpet, with a dull thud and rolling underneath his chair. Richard said it was a slip of his hand, his voice flat and completely devoid of an apology, telling me to pick it up. I stood there. This was a physical humiliation, a literal slap in the face. He wanted me to get down on my knees and crawl like a dog at his feet. Julian covered his mouth and started giggling, telling me to go ahead and pick it up. He mocked me, saying I was probably used to being on my knees scrubbing floors anyway, so it should feel completely natural. I took a deep breath and bent my knees. I lowered my body to the ground, reaching under the chair until my fingers closed around the cold metal pen. For a split second, I imagined driving it straight into Richard's femoral artery, imagining his screams and the blood soaking his expensive carpet. But I pushed the thought down. Not today. Today, I was going to give them a completely different kind of pain. I stood back up and placed the pen on the desk, thanking him. Richard tapped the paper, telling me to sign here and here. I pulled out a chair and sat down. My hands were shaking, and I made sure they saw the trembling. I put on my reading glasses, which were just a pair of cheap plastic lenses I bought at a pharmacy. I leaned over the paperwork and began to read. I read incredibly slowly, tracing my finger over every single word, pausing at commas and squinting at paragraphs. "Hurry up," Julian complained. "It's just standard boilerplate legal text. Just sign the damn thing. We have a lunch reservation at 1. I just want to make sure I see everything clearly," I mumbled. My eyes aren't what they used to be. I finished reading the waiver and then pulled the deed out of the envelope, reading through it again. I had to make sure they hadn't swapped the pages out. They hadn't. The Trojan horse was still right there. The acceleration clause was hidden in plain sight under the section titled Liabilities and Liens. It referenced an independent filing number that corresponded exactly to the debt I had bought out the night before. By signing this, they were legally acknowledging that debt and triggering the immediate payment demand. "You're wasting my time, Arthur," Richard roared, slamming his hand down hard on the desk. He threatened to have security throw me out right then and there, and said Clara could pack her bags and leave tonight. I jumped slightly in my chair, pretending to be utterly terrified, telling him I would sign it right away. I grabbed the pen. I am right-handed. I have been right-handed for 70 years. I throw baseballs with my right hand, I shoot guns with my right hand, and I held my wife's hand with my right hand. But today my right hand stayed completely flat on the desk. I picked up the pen with my left hand. My grip on the pen was incredibly awkward. The barrel felt completely foreign in my hand. I pressed the nib against the legal stationery, forcing my hand to tremble violently. The ink bled into the paper, creating a jagged, chaotic line. Arthur Vance. The signature looked like it was written by a child, or an old man suffering from severe advanced Alzheimer's. It was barely legible and looked utterly pathetic, and legally speaking, it was completely contestable. If they ever tried to enforce this liability, waiver in a court of law, down the road, My legal team would easily prove that I signed it under extreme duress, and that the signature didn't match my official record at all. But the deed, the actual property transfer agreement, was a completely different story. That specific signature would automatically trigger the algorithms in the banking liquidation system. Using that same trembling left hand, I signed the bottom of the deed. I put the pen down and told them it was done. Richard snatched the documents away, inspecting them closely. He didn't even notice that I had switched hands. He only saw his victory, and he only saw free land. He waved me off like a bothersome fly, telling me it was finally over and ordering me to get out because I was polluting his air. "What about Christmas?" I asked, keeping up the act. "Can I still come over for Christmas?" "We'll see," Julian said, actively shoving me toward the door. "Don't hold your breath. If there's an empty spot left in the garage, we'll let Clara know." They burst out laughing, their loud, arrogant voices echoing down the hall as if they were gods ruling over the world. I walked toward the exit, never looking back and never saying goodbye. I stepped out into the hallway, and the heavy double doors clicked shut behind me, sealing their laughter inside. I walked past the reception desk, the receptionist never even bothering to look up. I pressed the button for the elevator. The arrow above the door lit up. 3, 2, 1, beep! The doors slid open, but right before I could step into the cab, the dead silence of the hallway was shattered. First, a phone started ringing, then another one, and then a scream echoed out. The sound was coming from the executive suite. It was the sharp, panicked voice of Martha, Richard's executive secretary, who had been with the company for 20 years. "Mr. Sterling!" she screamed. "Mr. Sterling, stop the meeting right now." I stopped in my tracks. I held my hand over the elevator's motion sensor, keeping the doors completely wide open. I wanted to hear this. The heavy double doors I had just exited were violently thrown open. Martha came sprinting down the hallway, clutching a tablet to her chest. Her face was completely pale, like she had just seen a ghost. She rushed back into the office, and through the open door I could hear her voice perfectly. "Sir, the accounts!" she shouted. "The operating accounts, they're all frozen. Every single one of them." "What the hell are you babbling about?" I heard Richard bellow. "Call the bank. It's obviously a system glitch." "I already did," Martha cried out. "I called 3 different branches. They said the accounts had been flagged for forced liquidation. They said the primary creditor called in all our loans early." "What creditor?" Richard roared. "We have a long-term line of credit with First National." "Not anymore," Martha sobbed. "The debt was sold. It was bought out last night by a private equity firm. And, sir, they just registered a new asset transfer. That deed you just signed, it triggered the cross-default clause." "What?" Julian's voice cracked in pure panic. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means every single loan has to be paid back immediately," Martha screamed. "Right now, $220 million. They're seizing our assets. They're freezing payroll. They're locking down everything." I heard the distinct sound of glass shattering. Someone had just smashed a wine glass against the wall. "Who?" Richard's voice boomed like thunder. "Who is the creditor? Who bought our debt?" I leaned against the elevator wall and checked my watch. 12:15. Elena was incredibly efficient. I didn't stay to hear the answer, because I was the answer. I stepped into the elevator. The doors slowly slid closed, cutting off their panicked screaming. As the cab descended, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the cheap pharmacy reading glasses, and crushed them completely in my palm. I tossed the shattered plastic into the trash can in the corner of the elevator. I pulled a silk handkerchief from my inner pocket and thoroughly wiped down my left hand. The awkward grip on the pen had caused a slight cramp, so I stretched out my fingers. The elevator moved smoothly downward, playing calm, soothing jazz music. By the time I reached the lobby, all traces of panic had vanished from my face, but inside my head, I was roaring with laughter. I walked out of the building into the bright sunlight and pulled out my phone. There was a simple text message waiting for me from Elena, stating that the target was locked, and the blackout protocol was scheduled for 1800 hours. I texted back a single word: execute. I walked toward my truck. It was a long drive back to the farmhouse, and I still needed to stop by the store to buy some candles. Clara was going to need them when she came to me crying tonight. And this time I would be ready to wipe away her tears, not with a handkerchief, but with the truth. The trap had been sprung, the rats were caught, and this extermination was only just beginning. The drive back to the farmhouse was quiet, but my mind was racing. I couldn't hear the chaos exploding inside the Sterling offices, but I could feel it. I knew exactly how that algorithm worked. I had designed it myself, years ago, specifically to completely dismantle competitors who played dirty. It was like a domino effect. First, the primary loan gets called in, which alerts the secondary creditors, then the suppliers, and finally the credit card companies. It spreads faster than a virus. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was sitting in my favorite armchair. On the table in front of me was a tablet. Its screen split into 4 different video feeds. I wasn't watching television. I was monitoring the internal security feeds from the Sterling real estate headquarters and the living room camera inside my daughter's mansion. I had personally installed those cameras myself a few years ago when I helped them remodel. Julian thought I was just a helpful father-in-law who knew a bit about carpentry, and he never thought to ask why the lenses on the smoke detectors were so large. I looked at the office feed first. It was a masterpiece of pure destruction. Richard was pacing around his office like a trapped animal, his tie completely ripped open, his face masked in pure panic. He was screaming into a phone line that was obviously already dead, yelling at them to fix it, and demanding respect, because he was Richard Sterling and had kept his money in their bank for 30 years. He slammed the phone down so hard the receiver bounced off the desk and rattled onto the floor. Julian sat on the leather sofa with his head buried in his hands, looking incredibly small. He looked like a little boy who had lost his mother in a grocery store. Through the hidden microphone, Julian's muffled voice came through, telling his father that it was over. He explained that he had tried to order lunch on the corporate card, and it was declined. And when he tried his personal card, it was declined too. He told him they had frozen everything, even locking down the backup contingency accounts. "Shut up!" Richard roared, turning on his son. He blamed Julian, saying it was his fault and the fault of his stupid wife. He screamed that if Julian could just control her and manage the old man, none of this would be happening. My fault? Julian stood up, his fear instantly turning into rage. He pointed out that Richard was the one who threw coffee at her, and Richard was the one who demanded the land. He yelled that he had told his father it was a trap and that the old man was acting strange. "You useless piece of garbage," Richard spat back. He yelled that Julian had let a mechanic and his daughter ruin them, ordering him out of his sight to fix it. He told him to sell something or beg on the streets, but demanded liquidity before the market closed, or they were completely finished. I watched Julian storm out of the office, kicking over a trash can on his way out, sending paperwork flying everywhere. The employees outside the glass walls pretended not to notice, as they were already busy packing up their own cardboard boxes. The ship was sinking, and the rats knew it better than anyone. I muted the office audio. I had seen enough. The rats were officially eating each other. I enlarged the feed of the mansion's living room. Clara was there. She was on her knees, scrubbing fiercely at the stain left by last night's coffee spill on the carpet. She was humming a soft tune to herself, trying to keep herself calm. She had no idea her husband was rushing home, carrying a storm with him. I leaned forward, my heart rate starting to climb. I wanted to call her, wanted to tell her to get out of there immediately, but I knew she wouldn't listen. She would just think I was interfering in her life again. She needed to see exactly what kind of man Julian was with her own eyes. She needed to see the monster once the mask slipped off. The front door was violently thrown open, and Julian burst into the house. He didn't bother wiping the mud from his boots, stomping directly into the living room. Clara looked up, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, and offered a brave smile. As she greeted him, noting how early he was home, and asked if everything was all right, adding that she had almost gotten the stain out. Julian didn't answer. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and erratic. He was looking for something to destroy. He had been stripped of all his power in the outside world, and he desperately needed to reassert his authority inside this house. He walked over to a side table where a beautiful ceramic vase sat. It was a blue and white, hand-painted Italian vase. I had bought them for their first anniversary. Julian picked it up. "Julian?" Clara stood up. "What are you doing?" He stared at her, then down at the vase. "Your father," he hissed, his voice shaking with pure rage. "Your father did this." He hurled the vase into the fireplace with all his might. It shattered into 1,000 pieces with a sharp, violent crash. Clara screamed, covering her mouth with both hands, begging him to stop and crying that he was scaring her. She begged him to tell her what was happening. "What's happening?" Julian roared, stepping over the shattered ceramic shards. He screamed that her father was a snake who had tricked them and made them go bankrupt. He yelled that they had nothing left, that the credit cards were canceled, the accounts were wiped out, and they were going to lose the house and the cars, blaming it all entirely on her. "Because of me?" Clara sobbed. "I didn't do anything." "Because you exist!" Julian screamed at the top of his lungs. He yelled that she was the one who brought that old bastard into his life, saying he should have listened to his father and married someone from his own world, a woman who knew how to be an asset, not a liability. He started cornering her. Clara backed away repeatedly until her spine hit the living room wall, leaving her with nowhere left to run. Julian stopped, inches from her face, breathing heavily. He looked down at this woman who loved him, who cooked for him, and who cleaned up his messes. But he didn't see a wife. He saw a target to unleash his rage on. I gripped the edges of my tablet so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. "Don't lay a hand on her, Julian," I whispered directly to the screen. "Don't make me come down there myself." Julian raised his hand. "You're a useless piece of garbage," he spat. "Just like your deadbeat dad." He brought his hand down. It wasn't another shove. It was a full-force backhanded slap. The sickening sound of flesh hitting flesh came through the high-definition speakers of my surveillance system. Clara's head snapped to the side, and she collapsed completely onto the floor, clutching her cheek. This time she didn't even scream. She just wept silently, curling her body into a ball to protect herself. Julian stood over her, looking down at his own hand. For a split second I actually thought he might show a shred of regret, thought he might drop to his knees and apologize, but he didn't. He simply adjusted his cuffs and took a step back. "Stop crying," he said coldly. "You look ugly when you cry. I'm going to the study to finish the rest of the whiskey before the bank comes and takes that away too. Clean this mess up and don't bother me." He turned and walked out, leaving my daughter alone on the floor, sobbing, surrounded by shattered ceramic pieces and her completely broken dignity. I laid the tablet down, stood up, and walked over to the farmhouse window, staring out at the dark woods. I took a deep breath in and let it out. The raw fury was entirely gone, replaced by something much colder and far more lethal, a calculated, precise desire for execution. I could have called the police. I could have had him arrested for domestic violence. But he would be out on bail in an hour. He would hire expensive lawyers, blame it on stress, or even turn the tables on her. And in the mental state Clara was currently in, she might actually forgive him. No, the police are for ordinary citizens. I am not an ordinary citizen. I am Judgment Day. I walked back to the desk and picked up the encrypted phone. "Elena," I said. "I'm here, sir," she answered immediately, her voice tight. She had been watching the video feeds, too. "I saw it, sir. Do you want me to send a tactical team over?" "No," I told her. "It isn't time yet. If we send people now, that's just a rescue. I don't want a rescue. I want a siege. I want him to feel what it's like to be completely powerless. I want him to know exactly what it feels like to be cold, dark, and utterly alone." "What are your orders?" Elena asked. "Cut the grid," I commanded. "All utilities?" "Everything," I replied. "Electricity, water, internet, gas. I want that mansion turned into a stone cave. I want the smart locks frozen solid, the heating shut down, and the refrigerator completely dead." "You copy?" "Copy that," Elena said. "Hacking into the municipal utility main network now, bypassing the local substation and rerouting the connections." I looked back at the screen. Julian had just walked into the study and was pouring himself a glass of scotch. He looked thoroughly pleased with himself, still acting like the king of his castle. Suddenly the desk lamp flickered once. He looked up, and an instant later everything plunged into total darkness. The tablet screen went black for a second before automatically switching over to night vision mode. The image turned into a grainy, glowing green. I watched Julian freeze in the dark, yelling out to ask what was going on. He stumbled around, groping for the light switch, flipping it up and down repeatedly. Click, click, click. Absolutely nothing happened. I switched the video feed back to the living room. Clara was still on the floor. When the lights went out, she stopped crying and raised her head. To her, the darkness wasn't scary at all. It was a shield, hiding her away from his sight. I picked up the phone again, shut off the water. Done, Elena said. Main valve closed remotely. Cut the cell service, I added. Deploying the jamming drones, Elena replied. They're already airborne, arriving over the target within 2 minutes. They won't have a signal, won't be able to make calls, and won't have any cellular data. Perfect, I said. I sat back down, watching my son-in-law fumble around in the dark on the night vision feed. He smashed his shin right into the desk, howling in pain, screaming about who turned the lights out. I took a sip of my cold coffee. I did, Julian, I said to the quiet room. I checked the time. It was 5 o'clock. The sun was setting incredibly fast, and the temperature was plummeting. Tonight, it was going to drop well below freezing. Welcome to the Stone Age, I muttered. I watched Julian try to use his phone. He held it up to the window, spinning around in circles, tapping furiously at the screen. No service? He muttered frantically. What the hell is going on? Panic was finally setting in. He was starting to realize that he wasn't just bankrupt. He was completely cut off. He was isolated, locked inside a cage with the exact mess he had created. I watched Clara slowly stand up in the pitch-black living room. She didn't call out to him, and she didn't beg for help. She walked straight toward the kitchen. She knew exactly where the candles were kept. She knew how to survive in the dark. I was the one who taught her. As for Julian, he could do absolutely nothing but sit there in total helplessness. I leaned back in my chair, settling in for a very long night. The real show was just getting started. When they hurt my daughter, they took away my light and my joy. Now I was taking away theirs, in the most literal sense possible. Let them sit in the dark, I thought. Let them freeze. Once the money, power, and lights are completely stripped away, let them reflect on what kind of garbage they truly are. I kept my eyes locked onto the screen, refusing to blink, refusing to sleep. I was the guardian waiting in the shadows, and when the sun rose tomorrow, I would bring the real fire. A dead silence settled over the estate. It wasn't the peaceful quiet you find in a library or a church, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a dead machine. For the first time in its history, the Sterling mansion had become nothing more than a giant pile of bricks and concrete. Without electricity, the smart home system was completely brain dead. The automated blinds were frozen halfway open, and the climate control system that kept the indoor temperature at a perfect 72 degrees was totally dead. The temperature inside was dropping rapidly, slowly matching the bitter winter chill outside. I watched it all through my tablet. The night vision lens showed me a dark world of luxury. Inside the $100,000 open kitchen, the top-of-the-line smart refrigerator with the touchscreen interface was slowly warming up. The imported cheeses, organic Wagyu, and vintage champagne were all starting to sweat, in the dark. Melting ice from the ice maker began pooling across the floor. It was a tiny detail, but it brought me an immense amount of satisfaction. It was the first sign of decay. Julian was pacing back and forth in the living room. He had thrown a cashmere overcoat on top of his suit, looking utterly ridiculous. He held his phone high in the air, walking in circles, trying to catch a signal that simply didn't exist. My jamming drones were hovering 500 feet directly above the roof, creating an invisible dome of total isolation. He was cut off from his bankers, cut off from his lawyers, and cut off from the vanity of social media. I watched him try to turn on the gas fireplace. He pressed the remote control button over and over again, completely clueless that the electronic ignition required electricity to work. He let out a frustrated scream and hurled the remote against the wall. It shattered, marking yet another broken object in his perfect world. Clara was in the guest bedroom. She had wrapped herself tightly in a heavy blanket, sitting by the window, reading a book by the faint glow of a single candle. She looked completely at peace. She was used to living with less, and she knew how to find warmth from within. But Julian was an empty shell. Without external material comforts, he was completely losing his mind. Around 8 o'clock, Julian finally snapped. The cold had seeped straight into his bones, and the dead silence was driving him crazy. But what truly broke him was the sheer inconvenience. He was a man who had never been denied by a machine in his entire life. I watched him grab his car keys and storm out of the house, leaving the front door completely unlocked. He didn't care about security anymore. He just wanted to escape the tomb he had built for himself. I knew exactly where he was going. There was only one place nearby he could go. Only one person he believed he could freely bully and demand service from. I set the tablet down, walked into the kitchen, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The rich aroma filled the small farmhouse. It was the smell of warmth and safety. 20 minutes later, the bright glare of headlights cut across my front window. My dogs started barking, but I silenced them with a single hand gesture. Then came a heavy pounding racket at the door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the heavy fist of an entitled man. I opened the door. Julian stood there, shivering violently from the cold. His expensive Italian leather shoes were completely caked in mud from my unpaved driveway. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot. Instead of saying hello, he pushed past me and shoved his way right into the farmhouse. God, it smells like wet dog in here, he said, wrinkling his nose. He walked straight toward the wood-burning stove, holding his hands out toward the heat and rubbing them together fiercely. Our power is out, he announced loudly, as if I should be deeply concerned. The whole estate is dark. The transformer must have blown. Those useless utility workers. I can't even get a cell signal. I slowly closed the door, blocking out the freezing air. I leaned against the frame, crossing my arms. Well, hello to you too, Julian, I said. What brings you out here? Julian completely ignored my greeting. He stood with his back to the stove, looking around my farmhouse with pure disdain, eyeing the plain wooden furniture and the old books on the shelves. I need to take a shower, he ordered. The water heater at the house is electric, and I can't take a cold shower. I have an important meeting tomorrow morning, and I need to look presentable. He started unbuttoning his coat, tossing it carelessly onto my rocking chair. I also need cash, he continued to command. Cards are being declined everywhere. My car needs gas. The fridge is off, so I need to go buy some food. He looked at me like it was his birthright. He wasn't asking. He was handing down directives. In his twisted mind, he was doing me a massive favor just by gracing my rundown shack with his presence. What are you standing there for? He snapped. Go get me a towel and pour me a cup of coffee. I have a splitting headache. I didn't move an inch. I just stared directly at him. I looked at this man who, just 4 hours ago, had slapped my daughter across the face, the same man who had laughed at me alongside his father just yesterday. Now he was standing in my house, boldly demanding my water and my money. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. I walked over to the rocking chair, picked up his cashmere coat, and felt how soft and warm the fabric was. Then I walked over to the front door, opened it wide, and threw the coat straight out into the mud. Julian's jaw practically hit the floor. What the hell are you doing? He roared. That's a $3,000 coat. I'm giving you 3 seconds to get out of here and go join it, I said, my voice low and perfectly steady. Julian burst out laughing, a sharp, disbelieving sound. Are you out of your mind? He asked. You're kicking me out? After everything I've done for you? I let you come to Christmas dinner. I let you see your daughter. Now I'm facing a crisis, and you're throwing a tantrum. You hit her, I said. Julian froze, a flash of pure guilt darting through his eyes. But an instant later, his signature arrogance took over right again. He let out a cold laugh, asking if she came running to complain. He scoffed that she always ran back to cry in her daddy's arms the second things got real. He told me that marriage is complicated and that I wouldn't understand, claiming people just lose control of their emotions sometimes, and telling me it was none of my business. He took a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He was taller than me, younger, and spent plenty of time sculpting useless muscles in the gym. He demanded the money, his voice hardening as he said he knew I kept cash, hidden in this shack, because he had seen me take money out of the wall before. He demanded $5,000, calling it a loan, and promising to pay me back as soon as the bank fixed their system, holding his hand out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. Julian smirked, fully believing he had won and thinking I was terrified. I pulled out a single bill, a $20 bill. I let it drift right down onto the floor, landing squarely between his mud-stained leather shoes. I told him to take it, explaining that there was a public gym 5 miles down the road where a shower cost $10. I told him to use the rest for a sandwich and keep the change, adding that he was going to need it. Julian looked down at the money, then back up at me. His face turned a violent, furious shade of purple, the veins bulging out on his neck. He spat on the floor, calling me a senile piece of garbage, screaming to ask if I really thought I could humiliate him and discard a sterling like a common beggar. He lunged at me. The movement was incredibly clumsy, a wide-open right hook where he threw his entire body weight behind the punch. He wanted to hurt me, wanted to shatter an old man's bones. Time seemed to slow down completely. I didn't feel a single shred of fear. I only felt the awakening of pure muscle memory. Instead of stepping back, I took a step directly into his space. As his fist closed in on my face, I raised my left forearm, deflecting his attack upward. The sheer momentum of his swing left his entire midsection wide open. I struck with my right hand, but not with a fist. I used a knife hand strike, driving it precisely into his solar plexus. It was an incredibly controlled blow, not enough to kill him, but more than enough to instantly paralyze his diaphragm. Julian made a sound like a leaking tire. His eyes bulged out of his head as the air was violently squeezed from his lungs. Before he could collapse, I grabbed his right wrist, twisting it sharply behind his back to lock the joint, applying exactly 3 pounds of pressure. Julian shrieked in pain. I dragged him through a half circle and kicked the back of his knee. His leg buckled completely, and his face slammed hard against the solid wooden floor. A loud thud echoed through the room as his nose cracked against the floorboards, blood instantly spurting out. I pinned him down, locking his wrist with one hand and slamming his face flat against the wood with the other. I wasn't even breathing heavily, and my heart rate barely climbed. Julian kept opening his mouth like a fish gasping for oxygen, trying desperately to struggle. But every single time he moved, I added an extra fraction of pressure to his wrist, sending jolts of pure agony shooting up his arm. "Stop!" he wheezed out in a ragged moan. "Stop! You're going to break it!" I leaned down, pressing my lips right against his ear. I tightened my grip, whispering to the boy, asking if he really thought having money made him a wolf. I told him he was nothing but a sheep carrying a credit card, someone who had never once fought for survival, never been freezing and never been starving. I grabbed a handful of his hair, yanking his head up before pressing it back down against the floor, softly but firmly. "But I have," I told him. "I've survived things that would make your blood run cold just hearing about them." Julian started crying, his tears mixing with the blood pooling from his nose onto the floorboard. He was completely, utterly terrified. The illusion of the weak father-in-law was shattered into a million pieces. He finally realized he was locked in a cage with a monster he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He sobbed, choking out a question to ask who I was, what kind of person I was. "I'm the guy who's about to teach you a lesson," I said. I stood up and released his arm. Julian immediately scrambled backward like a crab, clutching his wrist and staring up at me with wide, panicked eyes. He looked at the way I was standing. My weight was perfectly balanced, and my hands were loosely relaxed at my sides. That wasn't the stance of a mechanic. That was the stance of a soldier. "Get out," I commanded. Julian didn't argue, and he didn't throw out any tough guy threats. He scrambled to his feet, slipping slightly in his own blood. He rushed toward the door, pausing for a single second at the threshold to look back at me. He saw the $20 bill still lying on the floor. "Take it," I said. He hesitated. His pride fought against his desperation, but desperation won. He bent down, snatched the $20, and fled out into the pitch-black night. I watched him go. I saw him grab his mud-covered coat from the ground and scramble into his car. The vehicle backed out of the driveway, the tires spinning wildly and kicking up mud in pure panic. I shut the door and locked it tight, walking over to the kitchen sink to thoroughly wash my hands. I didn't want a single trace of his weakness on me. I walked back into the living room and looked down at the puddle of blood on the floor. I would clean that up in a little bit. I picked up the tablet and switched the feed back to the estate. Julian was going to return to a freezing, pitch-black house. He was going back with a broken nose and a shattered ego. He would try to explain to Clara what happened, but he would never admit he got beaten to the ground by an old man. He would lie, but Clara would see the sheer terror in his eyes. That was the very first step. I sat back down in my chair and took a sip of my coffee, which was still warm. The physical conflict was over. I won the skirmish, but the psychological war was just starting. Tomorrow, I was taking everything. Tomorrow, I was going to strip the Sterling legacy down until there was nothing left but bare bones. I looked at the surveillance feed and saw Clara fast asleep by the window. "Sleep tight, baby girl," I whispered softly. "Daddy's awake, and the monsters are all terrified." I cleaned the blood off the floor using a rag and a bucket of diluted bleach. It was a highly familiar chore. For 40 years, I had cleaned up scenes for some of the most powerful people on the planet. Cleaning up the blood of a coward like Julian actually felt somewhat therapeutic. I scrubbed hard until the wood turned pale and smelled strongly of chemicals. I tossed the rag into the wood stove, watching it burn until the evidence of my violence was reduced to nothing but ash and smoke. An hour later, headlights swept across my front yard once again. This time, I didn't even need to look at the monitor to know who it was. I opened the door and just waited. Clara walked inside. She wasn't wearing a coat, still wrapped tightly in the heavy blanket I had seen on the monitor. She was barefoot, shoved into a pair of canvas sneakers. Her face was swollen, and the cheek where Julian had struck her had turned a nasty, dark shade of purple and black. Without saying a single word, she walked straight into my arms. I held her tight, holding my little girl close. I could feel her trembling violently in my embrace. It was a deep, bone-deep shake that had nothing to do with the cold outside. It was the shudder of a soul that had finally shattered completely. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, wrapped another blanket around her shoulders, and helped her sit down in the armchair, the exact same chair I had sat in hours ago while watching her suffer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice completely hoarse. "I'm so sorry, Dad. You were right. You were right about everything." I sat down on the coffee table in front of her, taking her freezing hands into my palms. "Why didn't you leave sooner, Clara?" I asked gently. "I need to know why. You're a brilliant woman. You've designed $100 million architectural projects. You are strong. Why did you let this man turn you into this?" Clara looked down at her hands, her tears dripping onto her lap. "He has a video," she said. The air inside the small cabin turned completely solid. "What video?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level. "Private," she replied. "From our honeymoon. I didn't know he was filming. 6 months ago, when I first brought up getting a divorce, he told me about it. He said if I ever filed papers, he would leak it. He said he'd send it to the partners at my firm, put it online. He said he would completely destroy my reputation so I could never show my face in the New York design scene ever again." I closed my eyes. The fire burning in my chest went completely white-hot. This wasn't just abuse. It was extortion. It was the weaponization of intimacy. Julian hadn't just struck her. He had used her own dignity as a chain to keep her enslaved. He told me I was nothing without the Sterling name, she continued to sob. He said I was just low-class trash from upstate New York who got lucky marrying rich. He said if I left him, I'd go right back to being garbage. And today, when the lights went out, when he hit me, I realized he was right. I am garbage, Dad. I let him do this to me. I stood up and walked over to the window, staring out into the pitch-black forest. You are not garbage, I said firmly. You are a Vance. The only reason you forgot that is because I hid my real identity for far too long. I turned around to face her. It's time you knew the truth, Clara. I walked into the bedroom, pushed the heavy dresser aside once again, and opened the safe. I pulled out the second folder, a highly confidential dossier labeled Julian Sterling that I had spent 5 long years compiling. I walked back out and dropped the heavy file right into her lap. Open it, I told her. Clara looked up at me in pure confusion. She opened the folder. The very first page was a bank statement. What is this? She asked. That's a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, I explained. It belongs to Julian. Look at the deposit history. She scanned the numbers, her eyes suddenly going wide. These are transfers, she whispered. From my firm's account, from the Employee Benefits Fund. $50,000 a month. For 3 straight years, he's been embezzling money from your firm, I told her. He forged your authorized signature. He isn't just a terrible husband, Clara. He's a felon. He's been stealing the salaries of the young designers you've been trying to mentor just to pay off his gambling debts. Clara flipped to the next page. It was photos. High-definition surveillance photographs. Julian with a blonde woman in a Las Vegas casino. Julian with a brunette woman in a Miami hotel. Julian with the receptionist from Richard's own office. He threatened you with a video, I said. But I have gigabytes of data on him. He told you he was working late, but he was actually taking your client's money to play blackjack with call girls. Clara stared at the photographs. The image of the man she thought she was protecting, the man she had sacrificed her dignity to appease, collapsed completely before her eyes. He betrayed me, she murmured. With her, with all of them. He didn't just betray you, I added. He laughed at you. I have audio recordings, Clara. Recordings of him bragging to his friends about how he kept you on a tight leash like a dog. He called you his goose that lays the golden eggs. He said as long as he had that video, he could spend your money for the rest of his life. Clara hurled the file onto the floor. She buried her face in both hands and let out a scream. It was a scream of pure agony, a heart-wrenching sound of utter betrayal. I let her scream. She needed to purge that poison from her system. When she finally went quiet, she raised her head to look at me. The look in her eyes had completely shifted. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by something much harder, a glare that mirrored the exact spark in my own eyes. He threatened to destroy me? She said coldly. Yes, I replied. He stole money from my firm. Yes, he hit me. I gave a single nod. So what are we going to do, Dad? She asked. How do we make him stop? I smiled, a sharp wolf-like grin. We aren't just going to make him stop, Clara. We are going to make him regret ever being born into this world. I stood up and walked to the center of the room, telling her to wait right here for me. I walked into the bedroom and closed the door. I went straight to the deepest part of my closet and ripped the plastic cover off the suit. The custom Savile Row charcoal gray Italian wool suit that cost $6,000 10 years ago still fit me absolutely perfectly. I stripped off my flannel shirt and kicked off my work boots, shedding the disguise of the humble mechanic completely. I pulled on the white dress shirt, the silk fabric feeling cool against my skin. I buttoned it up, slid into the suit pants, and slipped my feet into the mirror-polished black calfskin Oxfords. I tied my tie into a perfectly symmetrical Windsor knot. I threw on the suit jacket, and it settled over my shoulders like a suit of bulletproof armor. Finally, I opened the velvet box on the dresser. Inside sat a Patek Philippe Calatrava watch, rose gold with a leather strap, a timepiece that whispered absolute power. I buckled it onto my left wrist, hiding the faint scar left behind from a knife fight decades ago. I looked at myself in the mirror. Arthur the mechanic was gone. Arthur the victim was gone. Standing there was Arthur Vance, the cleanup man, the person who used to walk into boardrooms and make billionaires tremble and weep, the man who held the master key to everyone's skeletons. I opened the bedroom door and walked back into the living room. Clara looked up, her mouth hanging slightly open. She had never seen me look like this in her entire life. She grew up believing we were poor, believing I was barely scraping by at the bottom of the social ladder. "Dad," she asked softly, "who are you really?" I walked toward her. Even the sound of my footsteps was different now, heavy, echoing, and carrying an absolute authority. I reached a hand out and told Clara to stand up, describing myself as the man who was about to burn their entire world down to ashes. She took my hand and rose to her feet. She stared at my suit, at my watch, and at my face. For the first time in years, a profound sense of safety washed over her. I told her to dry her tears, saying the time for crying was officially over, and that tonight we weren't mourning. Tonight we were hunting. I picked up the dossier from the floor and tested her, asking if she still wanted to save her marriage. Clara glanced down at the photograph of Julian kissing another woman, then looked right back at the bank statements, documenting the embezzled funds. "No," she said flatly, "I want to bury it." "Good," I replied. I walked over to the front door and threw it open. The freezing night air rushed into the cabin, but this time it felt completely exhilarating. I told her to follow me, noting that we had a meeting to attend. She asked where we could possibly be going in the middle of the night and who we were going to see. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. "Elena." "At your service, sir." "Get a car ready," I ordered. "Not the truck?" "The Rolls-Royce Phantom." "Right away, sir," she replied. "It's already parked in the old barn behind your farmhouse." "And Elena," I added, "contact the board of directors at the Sterling Group. Then call the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Inform them that the chairman of the Vance Holding Group is personally reporting a massive corporate embezzlement case." I hung up the phone. Clara just stared at me, completely stunned, repeating the word phantom and asking if I actually owned a Rolls-Royce. I gave her a quick wink, telling her I owned a lot of things she didn't know about, including a flawless plan to win back her reputation and put her husband exactly where he belonged, behind bars. I offered her my arm, asking if she was ready to go, addressing her as Mrs. Sterling before correcting myself to Miss Vance. Clara straightened her spine, pulling the old blanket around her shoulders like a queen's royal cape. She raised her chin high. "Vance," she said firmly, "most definitely Ms. Vance." We walked out of the farmhouse together. We bypassed the rusty pickup truck and headed straight to the old barn in the backyard that had been locked up for years. I punched the security code into the keypad, and the heavy barn doors slid wide open. Under the bright glare of the floodlights, the black Rolls-Royce Phantom gleamed in the dark. It was a massive steel beast, a literal land shark on wheels. I opened the passenger door for my daughter, telling her to get in and declaring that the war had officially begun. As I slid into the driver's seat and fired up the quiet yet incredibly powerful V12 engine, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Richard and Julian were currently sitting in the dark, freezing their assets off, completely convinced that everything would be fine the second the banks opened in the morning. They had absolutely no idea that the bank was personally coming for them, and the interest on their debt was going to cost them their entire lives. The sun rose over the edge of the city, but it brought absolutely zero warmth to the Sterling men. I sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce Phantom, parked less than a block away from the rundown motel where they had spent the night. It was a cheap, sketchy place with flickering neon signs and walls so thin you could hear everything happening next door. It was the only spot in town that still accepted cash, and they didn't have much cash left to begin with. I watched them step out onto the pavement. The sight was utterly pathetic. Richard Sterling, the billionaire real estate tycoon, was still wearing yesterday's suit, now completely wrinkled and stained with sweat. Julian followed closely behind him, walking with a distinct, heavy limp, the aftermath of the lesson I had personally handed him at the farmhouse. A thick white piece of gauze from a local pharmacy was taped across his broken nose. They looked exactly like refugees fleeing a disaster they had completely created themselves. They were utterly desperate. Late last night, Elena had sent a message directly to Richard's private email inbox. To them, it looked like a literal lifeline, a formal meeting invitation from the chairman of the Vance Holding Group. The subject line read simply, "Debt Restructuring Negotiations." To the Sterlings, it felt like a miracle. They fully believed Vance Holding was just another Wall Street vulture they could easily handle with sweet talk, corporate jargon, or a few bribes. They thought they could walk into that room, flash a couple of smiles, and get their accounts unfrozen. They had absolutely no clue that the chairman they were going to meet was the exact same old man they had thrown out of their house. I watched through the tinted glass as they tried to fix their appearance using the car windows as a reflection. Richard tried to smooth down his hair, and Julian tried to adjust his tie, though his hands were visibly shaking. They were terrified, but at the same exact time, they were still incredibly arrogant. Even after hitting absolute rock bottom, they still genuinely believed they were born to be on top. They truly believed the world owed them a comeback. I gestured to the driver. "To the building," I ordered. "I want to be in my seat before they arrive." The Phantom glided smoothly away from the curb. I adjusted my cuffs. Today I was wearing a sharp, navy blue pinstripe suit that felt as crisp as a blade. I felt completely at peace, the distinct kind of calm that only comes right before an execution. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in the executive boardroom on the 50th floor of the Vance Tower. The room was specifically engineered to intimidate anyone who walked inside. The conference table was a 20-foot slab of solid polished obsidian. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls surrounded the room, offering a sweeping view of Manhattan, and from this height, the Sterling building looked incredibly small and utterly defenseless. Elena walked into the room holding her tablet. "They've arrived, sir," she reported. "They are currently screaming at the reception desk because security is making them verify their identification documents." "Let them in," I said, "and remember the rule. Do not use my name. Just address me as the chairman." "Understood," she replied, turning to exit the room. I spun my chair around. It was a high-backed, heavy black leather executive chair. When I turned it, I was facing directly out the window. Anyone walking through the double doors would only see the back of the chair and the back of my head. All they would see was the faint curl of gray smoke rising into the air from the cigar I had just lit. I heard the heavy double doors push open. I heard the sound of expensive leather shoes stepping onto the marble floor, though the footsteps sounded incredibly hesitant. "Gentlemen," Elena's voice cut through the room, cold enough to freeze water. "The chairman is expecting you. Please have a seat." I heard the sound of chairs being pulled out. I didn't turn around, keeping my eyes locked on the city skyline as I took a slow, deliberate drag from my cigar. "Mr. Chairman," Richard's voice broke the silence. He was shaking slightly, but he was trying his absolute best to sound confident. "Thank you for taking the time to see us on such short notice. It is an honor, truly an honor. My name is Richard Sterling, and this is my son, Julian. We represent the Sterling Group." I maintained total silence, letting the quiet stretch out. I wanted to make the atmosphere completely unbearable. I wanted to watch them sweat. Richard cleared his throat nervously. "I'm assuming you are the one who bought out our debt yesterday," he continued. "I have to admit it was an incredibly aggressive move. Highly admirable. But I believe there has been a massive misunderstanding here, perhaps a system error in the computers. Our assets are incredibly healthy, and we haven't defaulted a single time in 30 years. This freeze on our accounts is frankly legally indefensible, but we are willing to let bygones be bygones. We are entirely open to partnering with you." I still didn't say a single word. I simply tapped the ash from my cigar into a crystal ashtray. Julian chimed in immediately after his father. Because of his broken nose, his voice sounded heavily nasal and congested. "Listen, sir," he said, "we know how this game works. You just want a piece of the action. We can give you equity. We can give you a seat on our board. Just unfreeze the accounts. We are facing a massive liquidity crisis before noon. If you help us out here, we can make you an incredibly wealthy man. I almost burst out laughing right then and there. They were offering to make me wealthy. Me, the man who owned the very skyscraper they were currently sitting in. I decided it was time. I spoke directly toward the glass window, using the room's acoustics to make my voice sound deep, carrying a heavy echo. You say there's been a misunderstanding, Richard, I said. Richard let out a sharp gasp. He seemed to recognize something in the voice, but in this specific setting, his brain couldn't map the connection at all. Yes, sir, he stammered out quickly. A massive misunderstanding. We are a respectable family. We are the pillars of this community. Pillars? I repeated the word. Is that what you call people who pour scalding hot coffee on women? The air inside the room went completely dead. It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the space. I could hear Julian take a sharp, panicked breath. I'm sorry, Richard whispered, his voice dropping low. I don't understand what you mean. I took one final drag of my cigar and crushed it completely out in the crystal ashtray. You said you're willing to partner with me, I said. You said you want to give me a seat on your board. Yes, Richard's voice was thoroughly trembling now. Anything. Whatever you want. It's yours. I rose to my feet. I gripped the top of the leather backrest with both hands. What I want, I said, raising my volume until it boomed through the room, is for you two to finally learn a lesson. I violently spun the chair around, slowly turning my body to face them directly. The look on their faces right then was worth every single cent of the $220 million I had spent buying out their debt. Richard's mouth dropped open so wide it looked like an apple could fit inside. His eyes practically bulged out of his skull. He looked like he was on the verge of having a medical stroke. He gripped the edges of the obsidian table so tightly that his fingernails turned completely white. Julian made a choking sound like he was being strangled by the throat. He threw his weight backwards so fast his chair almost flipped over completely. He instinctively raised both hands to cover his face, looking exactly like he thought I was about to strike him again. Arthur... Richard squeezed the name out in a breathless whisper. It sounded like a desperate prayer, filled with utter disbelief. Well, hello, Richard, I said smoothly. Hello, Julian. No, Richard babbled incoherently. No, this is impossible. You're a mechanic. You drive a broken-down truck? I walked around the obsidian table, my stride carrying a heavy, suffocating pressure. I stood directly over them, dressed in a custom Italian suit, the Patek Philippe watch on my wrist, catching the light as I looked down at them with pure contempt. I used to be a mechanic, I told them. That part is true. But the only reason I retired is because I made enough money to buy people like you out and sell you right back off 10 times over. You're the chairman of Vance Holding? Julian asked, his voice squeaking at a high pitch. I am Vance, I said. That is my family name. Did you two never bother to ask what Clara's last name was before she got married? Did you never care enough to check her family history? No, of course you didn't, because you were far too busy looking down on her. Richard bolted upright from his chair. His legs were shaking so violently that he had to lean his entire body weight against the obsidian table just to keep himself standing. This is a scam, he screamed, his face turning a furious shade of purple. You're an actor. Someone hired you. Clara hired you. Where is the real chairman? I demand to see the real chairman. I turned my eyes toward Elena. Elena, I said calmly, show him the paperwork. Elena instantly projected the documents onto the massive digital screen on the boardroom wall. It was the deed to the lakefront property, the exact paperwork they had forced me to sign yesterday. Zoom in on the signature, I commanded. The image enlarged, displaying the jagged, messy scribble I had forced out using my left hand. Now pull up the acquisition filings, I said. The screen shifted, displaying the official legal documents authorizing the buyout of the Sterling corporate debt. At the very bottom of the page sat a completely different signature, bold, powerful, and elegant, Arthur Vance. Right next to it was the hot wax stamp of my official fingerprint seal. Richard stared at the screen, then slowly turned his head back to look at me. Every ounce of denial crumbled away instantly replaced by a pure, unadulterated terror, so thick that the room practically smelled of desperate panic. Fu zai le zhengge, he whispered in utter despair. You orchestrated all of this? I didn't orchestrate a single thing, Richard, I told him coldly. I was thoroughly enjoying my quiet, peaceful retirement. I was perfectly content to sit back and watch you pretend to be a big shot. But then you put your hands on my daughter. I leaned in across the desk, getting my face right up into his. You dumped boiling hot coffee right down her front, I said through gritted teeth, my voice shaking with an absolute, deadly precision. You called her garbage. You forced her onto her knees to scrub your floor. And you, Julian, you slapped her across the face. You cheated on her. You stole from her firm. I didn't know, Julian whimpered, his voice cracking completely as he started to cry. I didn't know you actually had money. If you had known, you would have treated her better. I cut him off, my words dropping like absolute ice. That is exactly the core of the problem here. You people only respect money. You have zero respect for actual human beings, zero respect for loyalty, and zero respect for love. So I decided it was time to talk to you in the only language you actually understand. I reached down, picked up a thick folder from the desk, and slammed it down right in front of them. That is a formal demand for immediate payment, I told them. Every single one of your commercial loans is now called in full. $215 million. Do you have it? Richard collapsed backward into his chair, looking like he had aged a full 10 years in a split second. We don't have it, he said weakly, his voice sounding entirely hollow. You know we don't have that kind of capital. Our assets are tied up in real estate. We need time. You don't have time, I said. You have until the close of business today. If those funds are not transferred into my account by 5 o'clock sharp, I am initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings. I will take your corporate headquarters. I will take your Hamptons estate. I will take your luxury cars, and I will strip the very shirts off your backs. Arthur, please, Richard began to beg, tears actively welling up in his gray-blue eyes. This is our family legacy. My father built this firm from nothing. Please don't destroy us. We're family, remember? Family? I let out a loud laugh, a dry, bitter sound that echoed off the high walls. Yesterday you stood at that table and told me I wasn't family. Yesterday you called me a common beggar. Yesterday you sat me at the absolute far end of the table. I walked back over to my side of the desk and sat back down, immediately spinning the heavy leather chair around so my back was facing them once again. Get out of my office, I ordered flatly. But sir, Julian tried to chime in, his voice trembling. I said, get the hell out, I roared, the volume shaking the glass walls. Elena stepped forward smoothly, tapping her earpiece and calling for security to escort our guests out of the building. 2 massive, burly security guards instantly appeared in the doorway, grabbing Richard and Julian tightly by their arms. Wait! Richard screamed out as they started dragging him across the floor. Arthur, we can talk about this. We can make a deal. Take the company. Just let me keep the house. Please, I'm begging you. I didn't look back once. I just sat there listening to their desperate, echoing screams fade away down the long corridor. When the heavy double doors finally clicked shut, a total peaceful silence returned to the boardroom. Elena walked up to the edge of my desk, noting that the effect was absolutely staggering. We aren't finished yet, Elena, I said, staring out at the distant silhouette of the Sterling building across the skyline. They still have a shred of hope left. They think they can find some high-priced corporate lawyer to exploit a loophole in the text. I spun the chair back around to face her. Call the district attorney, I commanded. Hand over the complete file on Julian's embezzlement and fraud charges. It's time to open up the second front of this war. Elena gave a single nod and walked out of the room. I sat entirely alone in the massive boardroom, looking down at my own hands. They were perfectly, completely steady. Those arrogant fools wanted to start a war with an upstate country hick. Instead, they woke up a tyrant, and tyrants never leave survivors behind. The security guards didn't actually throw them out onto the street right away. I had explicitly instructed Elena to hold them down in the main lobby. I wanted this show to keep running. I wanted the grand finale to play out in front of a live crowd, making sure the receptionists, the couriers, and the janitorial staff witnessed every single second of their collapse. I took the private elevator straight down to the ground floor. When the doors slid open, the scene playing out was exactly what I had anticipated. Richard Sterling hadn't gone quietly at all. He was clinging onto the marble reception desk like a barnacle stuck to the hull of a sinking ship, screaming at the top of his lungs. His face was a twisted mask of red veins and cold sweat as he held a phone receiver, roaring into the line. "I want to report a crime," he shrieked. "Get me the FBI. We have an intruder, a scam artist. He hacked straight into our servers. He forged official legal documents. Send everyone you have." Then he caught sight of me stepping out of the elevator bay. His eyes instantly lit up with a wild, manic joy, and he pointed a shaking finger right at me. "That's him!" he screamed out of the phone. "That's the imposter. He's right here. Hurry up, don't let him escape." I walked across the polished marble floor of the lobby, the sharp click of my Oxfords echoing through the vast space. I didn't rush, and I didn't hesitate for a single second. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from him, slipped my hands casually into my suit pockets, and just waited in total silence. Julian stood a few paces behind his father, his eyes glued firmly to the floor. Unlike Richard, Julian knew exactly what he was dealing with. He had already felt the raw strength in my hands the night before at the farmhouse. He knew trying to use force against me was completely useless. But Richard was a man who had spent 68 years living inside a bubble of absolute privilege. He genuinely believed that the law existed solely to serve him, and that the police department was just his personal security detail. "You're completely finished, Arthur." Richard slammed the phone receiver down and spat on the floor. "I just called the police chief directly. We play golf together every single weekend. He's sending patrol cars right now. They are going to slap handcuffs on you and drag you out of here in front of everyone. You honestly thought you could walk in here with some fake paperwork and a cheap suit and steal my entire company? You're out of your mind." I looked over at the crowd of corporate employees gathering near the elevators. They were whispering among themselves, watching the total ruin of their emperor. "Do you honestly believe the garbage coming out of your mouth, Richard?" I asked, my voice completely calm. "Do you truly believe a simple mechanic could just hack into a major banking network? Do you honestly think a farmer could forge a fully notarized property deed?" "I know you're nothing but a pathetic fraud," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just a sad old poor man who can't accept reality, so you hallucinated this entire fantasy. Well, reality is about to walk right through those glass doors. The second the police get here, I'm suing you for everything you have. I'm going to strip you bare. I will seize your truck, your rundown shack, and that fake watch on your wrist." He looked so completely confident that he actually took a moment to smooth down his tie and fix his hair, already preparing his victory speech. He turned toward the receptionist, barking out an order as if he still owned the building, telling her to get him a cup of coffee and call his wife to tell her they'd be a little late for dinner, but that everything was perfectly under control. The receptionist didn't move an inch. She didn't even look at him. She looked at me, and I gave her a tiny, barely visible nod of my head. She stayed firmly seated in her chair. Richard looked around the lobby in pure confusion, demanding to know why nobody was listening to him, screaming that he was the owner of the building. "Not anymore," I said softly. Right at that exact moment, the loud wail of police sirens echoed through the street outside. Red and blue emergency lights started flashing violently against the glass revolving doors. 3 patrol cars came to a screeching halt right at the curb. Richard let out a highly predatory, arrogant laugh. "The cavalry is here," he said, looking at me with pure triumph. "Goodbye, Arthur." The revolving doors spun open and 4 police officers marched into the lobby. The man leading the pack wasn't a standard patrolman. It was Police Chief Harrison himself. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a jawline that looked like it was carved out of solid granite. He walked in with heavy, authoritative strides, his hand resting firmly on his service weapon. Richard immediately ran toward him, practically throwing his entire body weight onto the chief. "Chief Harrison!" Richard cried out, sounding incredibly desperate. "Thank you, God, you're here. It's this man right here. This old man. He broke into my private offices, assaulted my son, and tried to use forged documents to steal my entire skyscraper. Arrest him immediately. He is incredibly dangerous." Richard pointed his finger directly at me, turning around to look at me with eyes full of absolute victory. He was fully expecting to see me turn pale, run away, or drop to my knees to beg for mercy. But I just stood there, taking a slow, steady breath. Chief Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at Richard, then looked over at the finger pointing directly at my face. He frowned deeply. He reached out with a massive hand, gently but firmly pushing Richard completely out of his way. "Step aside, Mr. Sterling," the chief said, his deep voice echoing across the marble. "You're blocking my view." Richard stumbled backward, completely lost for words, stammering out that he was the victim here. The chief didn't pay attention to a single word he said. He walked straight past him, coming to a halt, exactly 3 feet in front of me. The entire lobby went dead silent. Everyone held their breath. Richard was still wearing a smug grin, fully expecting the handcuffs to come out. Then the chief did something that completely sucked the air right out of Richard's lungs. He brought his heels together with a sharp snap, straightened his spine completely, and raised his right hand to deliver a perfect, flawless military salute. "Colonel Vance," the chief said, his voice ringing out with a deep, unshakable respect. I gave him a casual, relaxed salute back. "At ease, Sergeant," I said. "It's been a long time." "Too long, sir," Chief Harrison replied, lowering his hand. "I saw the alert flash on the encrypted channels. I had no idea you were operating back in the New York grid. If I had known, I would have personally arranged an official escort for you." "You know my rules, Harrison. I prefer to operate in the shadows," I told him. Richard let out a strangled shriek that sounded like a dying cat. He stepped forward, his entire body trembling violently. "Colonel?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "What? What did you just call him?" Chief Harrison turned his head to look at Richard, all the warmth instantly vanishing from his eyes. He stared at Richard like he was looking at a piece of dirt stuck to the bottom of his boot. "I called him by his rank, Mr. Sterling," the chief said coldly. "This is Colonel Arthur Vance, retired from the Military Intelligence Service Special Operations Command. He is the master instructor who personally trained half the ranking officers in this entire department, including myself." Richard shook his head in pure denial, screaming that it was impossible, claiming I was just a mechanic who worked in an auto shop. "That was his cover identity," the chief explained. "If the colonel was using a cover identity, it means he was handling a high-priority assignment. And if he's officially dropping that cover now, it means you people are in an absolute world of trouble." Richard stared at me as reality crashed down on him like an absolute tidal wave. All those years I had spent acting like a simple, quiet old man. All those times he had openly mocked me while I just sat there and took it. It was all a game, and he had been nothing but a clueless pawn the entire time. "You knew," Julian whispered in pure despair, staring over at the chief. "You knew exactly who he was all along. Anyone who actually matters in this city knows exactly who he is," Chief Harrison replied. "Colonel Vance is a living legend." I took a step forward, closing the physical distance between myself and Richard. "You called the police, Richard," I said, my voice echoing off the walls. "You wanted the law to intervene. Well, the law is standing right here. But the law requires actual evidence, and I just happen to have prepared some for you." I gestured to Elena, who was standing near the elevators. She walked over smoothly and handed me a thick black leather folder. I flipped it open. "Nikanga Wajapyan," I said, looking down at them. "You called me a liar and a thief. So let's take a look at who the real criminal is in this room." I pulled a document from the folder, holding it up high for the chief and the entire crowd of employees to see. "This is a forensic audit report of the Sterling Group," I announced, raising my voice so every single staff member in the lobby could hear it clearly. "It documents 15 years of systematic tax evasion. It lists the offshore accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands. and it outlines exactly how you've been laundering money for organized crime syndicates to hide kickbacks from your construction projects. Richard's face went completely ash gray, and his knees buckled so hard he almost fell over. "That is internal corporate data," he gasped out, fighting for breath. "You can't show that to anyone. You stole that information." "It isn't stealing if you own the company," I told him with absolute malice. "As your primary creditor and the sole holder of your corporate debt, I have every legal right to audit my own ledgers. And what I found in here, Richard, is more than enough to ensure you spend the rest of your natural life inside a federal penitentiary." I flipped to the next page. "And then we have the bribery records," I continued. "Direct payouts to zoning inspectors, cash delivery logs to city council members. Your entire empire was built on pure corruption, Richard. You honestly believed your wealth put you completely above the law, but you forgot that every single dollar leaves a trail, and I happen to be the best tracker on the planet." I slammed the folder shut with a loud snap that echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. I handed the files directly to Chief Harrison. "Take it," I told him. "That is everything the district attorney needs. I want them detained immediately on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and extortion." Chief Harrison took the folder and gave a sharp nod. "Yes, sir." Richard collapsed completely, his legs giving out as he dropped straight down onto the freezing marble floor. He reached out with shaking hands, grabbing onto the bottom of my suit pants, completely broken. "Arthur, please!" he wailed, his tears spilling over without restraint. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. It was the accountants. It was an oversight. Don't do this. I'm an old man. I can't go to jail." I looked down at him. I looked at the crown of his head beneath his expensive hairstyle. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No triumph. Only the cold, pure satisfaction of a job completed. "You aren't a pathetic old man, Richard," I said. "You're a criminal and a bully. You dumped hot coffee on my daughter because you thought she was an easy target. You tried to blackmail me for my land because you thought I was stupid." I leaned down close to his ear. "I didn't just buy your debt," I whispered. "I bought your freedom. I hold the power of life and death over your family legacy. You're going to die in a cell, Richard, and you're going to die completely broke." I stood up and kicked his hands away from my leg. "Get him out of my sight," I told the chief. Chief Harrison made a gesture. 2 officers grabbed Richard by the arms and hauled him up. He was sobbing openly now, tears and snot smearing his face, as he begged for a forgiveness that was never going to come. Julian tried to make a run for it. He spun around and lunged toward the revolving doors, but the other 2 officers were faster. Before he could even take 3 steps, they tackled him straight to the ground. I watched them get cuffed. I watched them get dragged out of the very building they used to rule. I watched the employees, the people they had stepped on for years, pull out their phones and start recording. The chief lingered for a second. "Any further instructions, Colonel?" he asked. "No, Harrison," I said. "Just make sure the media gets a high-definition close-up of them in the back of those squad cars." "Understood, sir." The chief turned and left. I stood completely alone in the center of the lobby. A profound quiet returned to the room. The employees were all staring at me, looking absolutely terrified. They had no idea what kind of boss I was going to be. I looked over at Martha, the receptionist. "What's your salary, Martha?" I asked. She swallowed hard. $40,000 a year, sir." "Make it 60," I said. "Tell everyone to get back to work. We have a massive mess to clean up." A genuine smile broke across Martha's face. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." I turned and walked toward the elevators. I had taken their money, and I had taken their freedom, but I wasn't finished yet. There was one final piece of the puzzle, one last humiliation required to ensure the sterling name could never rise from the ashes. I pressed the button for the penthouse suite. The elevator doors slid shut. The stage of denial was over. Now came the stage of acceptance, and for them, that reality pill was going to be fatally bitter. The legal machinery of the Vance Holding Group moved faster than a striking viper. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, the Sterling estate was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. It was a seized asset. It was a carcass being picked clean by judicial vultures. I sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce parked on a distant winding mountain pass, watching it all through the tinted windows. I didn't need to get close to smell the fear. I could see the flashing lights of the county sheriff's vehicles. They weren't the red and blue emergency strobes, but the steady amber glow of civil enforcement. A convoy of flatbeds blocked the massive cast-iron gates. They weren't moving trucks. They were heavy-duty asset recovery trailers. Men in gray uniforms operated with military precision, holding clipboards and rolls of neon orange security tape. They weren't there to pack up personal belongings with bubble wrap. They were there to tag it, log it, and haul it all away. I watched the head of the enforcement team cut the padlock on the main gates. The Sterling family crest, that cast-iron symbol of their arrogance, was forced open with a sickening metal screech. The trucks roared down the driveway, looking exactly like armored vehicles rolling into a conquered city. Inside the house, the staff was in total panic. I had received a text earlier from Martha, who had gotten in touch with the estate's housekeeper. She told me the maids were crying, not out of sorrow for the Sterlings, but out of fear that they wouldn't get paid. I texted Martha back immediately, assuring her that Vance Holding would cover every single cent of their back wages in full. I am not a monster. I don't punish the innocent for the sins of the guilty. But for the guilty, there would be zero mercy. I watched the deputies slap notices onto the front door. Bright red sheets of paper stamped with the words eviction and foreclosure. They looked like a brand of pure shame on the mahogany panels. The neighbors were starting to gather. The doctors, lawyers, and corporate executives who lived in this wealthy enclave stood at the edge of their driveways, holding wine glasses, whispering and pointing fingers. In this world, social execution is infinitely more terrifying than physical death, and the Sterling family was undergoing a highly publicized, front-row public execution. I watched the repo men hook up the luxury vehicles to the tow trucks, the Bentley, the Maybach, and the vintage Jaguar that Richard loved more than life itself. One by one, they were violently winched onto the flatbeds. The sharp screech of tires dragging against the asphalt was the only protest they could make. Then came the climax of the afternoon. A yellow cab pulled up to the front gate. The door flew open, and Julian stumbled out, rolling onto the pavement. He had been bailed out, pending his preliminary hearing. The bail money had probably been cobbled together, using the absolute last shred of credit he could find, or borrowed from some foolish friend. He looked like a ghost. His suit was torn, his nose was wrapped in gauze, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He charged down the driveway, trying to physically block the tow truck driver who was strapping down the Bentley. "Stop!" he screamed. "That's my car. You can't take it. My lawyer is calling the judge right now." The driver didn't even look at him. He just kept tightening the ratchet straps. Click, click, click. It was the sound of irreversible fate. Julian ran to the front door and tried to turn the knob. It was locked tight. Every single lock cylinder had been replaced an hour ago. He began pounding his fists frantically against the solid wood. "Open up!" he wailed. "I live here. This is my house." A deputy stepped forward. He was a massive, burly guy who clearly had zero patience for entitled rich boys. "Sir," the deputy's voice echoed through the freezing air, "you need to step back. This property is currently under the control of a court-appointed receiver. If you do not leave the premises immediately, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." "Trespassing?" Julian's voice cracked completely. "My name is on the deed." "Not anymore," the deputy replied. "Step back." Julian collapsed right onto the front steps, burying his face in his hands and sobbing. It was the loud, pathetic wail of a little boy who had just had his favorite toy ripped away from him. He didn't care about the morality of what he had done. He only cared that he had lost. But the universe wasn't finished punishing Julian Sterling just yet. A bright red convertible Porsche rounded the corner with a loud screech of brakes, stopping dead in the middle of the driveway and blocking the path of the tow trucks. I recognized the car instantly from the surveillance photos. It belonged to Tiffany, the woman Julian had been supporting using my daughter's charity foundation. She was young, beautiful, and incredibly opportunistic. She slammed the car into park, jumped out, and strode forward. Even though the sun was setting, she was wearing a fur coat and dark, oversized sunglasses, holding her phone high in the air, recording a live video. "Julian!" she screamed. Julian looked up. For a split second, a tiny spark of hope flashed in his eyes. He thought she was there to save him, thought she was there to comfort him. "Tiffany," he said, standing up. "Thank God. You have to help me. They're taking everything." Tiffany didn't offer him a hug. She marched straight up to his face, keeping her phone held high, aiming the camera lens directly at his battered, pathetic face. "You total fraud," she yelled. "I went to the dealership today to get my oil changed, and you know what they told me? They said the lease on this car was canceled. They said the vehicle was reported stolen." Julian stammered, trying to explain that it was just a misunderstanding and that his accounts were just temporarily frozen. "Temporarily?" She laughed, a brutal, ice-cold sound. "I saw the news, Julian. You're completely broke. You're being indicted. You are a beggar." She shoved her face right into his. The neighbors were watching. The deputies were watching. The tow truck drivers stopped what they were doing to watch. The entire internet was watching, too. I checked my tablet, and she was streaming live on Instagram. 3,000 people were watching Julian Sterling beg like a dog. "Give me the keys to the apartment," she commanded. "The penthouse you promised me. You said you already bought it." I haven't bought it yet," Julian whispered, his voice dropping to a pathetic mumble. "I was planning to do it next week." "You absolute con artist!" Tiffany shrieked. "You wasted my time. You wasted my youth." Then she struck. She swung her hand, her long French manicured nails cutting through the air, and slapped him across the face. It wasn't a slap born out of passionate anger. It was a slap born out of pure, unadulterated disgust. The blow cracked sharply against his face, landing square on his broken nose. Julian let out a pathetic shriek, collapsing backward onto the gravel driveway. Tiffany looked down at him with utter contempt. "Don't you ever call me again," she said. She turned back to her phone camera, smoothing down her hair. "See that guy?" she told her followers. "That is exactly what happens when you date a loser pretending to have money. Stay smart, girls." She climbed back into her Porsche, slammed on the gas, and tore away in a cloud of exhaust, leaving Julian lying entirely alone in the dirt. I witnessed every single second of it. I felt a cold, hard sense of deep satisfaction settle into my chest. This was the universe correcting its own scales. He had humiliated Clara in private. Now he was being publicly executed in front of the entire world. I tapped on the soundproof glass partition, and the driver lowered the window. "Sir?" he asked. "Pour the wine," I ordered. The driver opened the small built-in refrigerator in the center console and pulled out a bottle. It was a vintage Chateau Margaux, expensive, complex, and a deep red that looked exactly like blood. He poured a splash into a crystal glass and handed it back to me. I took the glass and held it up against the fading light, swirling the deep crimson liquid inside the bowl. I looked down at the scene below. The house was pitch black. The cars were gone. The gates were broken. The men were destroyed. 24 hours ago, Richard Sterling had held a glass exactly like this one. He had used it as a weapon. He had used it to defile my daughter's face and her dignity, believing that glass of wine was a symbol of his absolute power and proof of our poverty. Now the tables had completely turned. I rolled down my window, and the freezing air rushed into the car. I could smell the scent of the oncoming winter snow. I took one final look at Julian. He was still sitting on the gravel, hugging his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth. He had no coat. He had no home. He had no wife, and he had no mistress. He had been stripped entirely bare. "To manners," I whispered. I didn't take a single sip of the wine. I held the glass out the window, tilting my wrist. The dark red liquid plummeted through the air, splashing heavily against the cold asphalt. It was a libation poured out for justice, a ritual to wash away the shame. I set the empty crystal glass down on the seat beside me and told the driver to move. The Phantom glided forward in total engineless silence. We drifted past the scene of utter destruction, slipping right by the neighbors who were far too busy gossiping to notice the black sedan with the heavily tinted windows. As we pulled away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. The Sterling estate kept shrinking into the distance until it was nothing but a dark smudge fading into the twilight. They had lost everything: money, reputation, and their freedom. But as I watched the darkness completely swallow them up, a thought suddenly flashed across my mind. It was the survival instinct, the alert defensive reflex I had honed through 40 long years of operating in war zones and corporate boardrooms. Rats are always the most dangerous when they are backed into a corner. Julian was completely broken. He was a coward at heart who would probably just curl up in some dark room and waste away from pure shame. But Richard was entirely different. Richard was old school. He was the man who built that empire with his own hands from nothing. Even if those hands were filthy, he still possessed his pride. And I hadn't just wounded his pride, I had personally signed its death warrant. I remembered the look in his eyes when the police dragged him away. It wasn't just fear. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. Absolute, distilled venom. He was going to get bailed out. Men like Richard always have a rainy day fund hidden away somewhere, or an old favor they can still call in, or a dirty lawyer who handles their black market problems. He would come looking for me, or worse, he would try to go after Clara. I picked up my phone and dialed Elena. "I'm here, sir," she answered. "Increase Clara's security detail immediately," I commanded. "And the second Richard gets out on bail, lock a tail on him. I want to know exactly when he eats, when he sleeps, and when he uses the restroom." "You think he's going to make a move?" Elena asked. "He has nothing left to lose," I replied, "and a man with absolutely nothing left is the only creature dangerous enough to threaten a man who owns everything." I stared out the window at the flashing city lights. The war was technically won, but the fight for survival never truly ends. Let him come, I thought. Let him try. I already took his house, and I already took his company. If he dares to lay a single finger on my daughter again, I am taking his life. I closed my eyes, letting the smooth flow of traffic carry me home. The wine had been spilled, and the debt had been collected, but the ledger was still resting slightly open, waiting for that one final transaction. The neon sign for the Starlight Motel buzzed like an angry, irritated hornet. It flickered erratically, casting a sickening pale green glow into the cramped room that was currently hiding the former king of real estate. Room 12 smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and deep regret. The carpet felt sticky underfoot, and the cheap wallpaper was actively peeling off the walls. For Richard and Julian Sterling, this wasn't just a sudden drop in social class. It was an absolute descent into hell. I was sitting inside my farmhouse study miles away, holding a glass of plain water. I watched these two rats start to tear each other to pieces through a pinhole camera feed, a camera I had paid the motel manager $50 to slip into the room an hour before they checked in. Richard was pacing aggressively back and forth across the small room. He had ripped his tie off, and his white dress shirt was completely soaked in sweat. He looked exactly like a fugitive who had been running for days without sleep. Julian sat on the edge of a collapsed, sagging mattress, holding a plastic bag of ice against his face. His nose had swollen into a nasty shade of purple and red from the combination of my strike and Tiffany's slap. "This is all your fault," Richard screamed, kicking the cheap particle board dresser so hard the top drawer slammed out and rattled onto the floor. "You and your women, your gambling debts. If you could have just kept your head down and played the part, we'd still be sitting in the mansion right now." "My fault?" Julian shot back, his voice heavily muffled through his swollen lips. "You were the one who insulted him first. You were the one who threw that coffee. You started this entire war, Dad. I was just the idiot who got caught in the crossfire." "Shut up," Richard roared. He grabbed a cheap table lamp and hurled it against the wall, sending shattered glass flying everywhere. "We aren't finished yet. You hear me? We are the Sterlings. We do not lose to a servant." He stopped pacing entirely, staring down at Julian with eyes that looked dangerously close to pure insanity. He has the evidence in his hands, Richard whispered, dropping his voice to a low, secretive mutter. He showed that folder to the police, but he didn't hand everything over to them. He's keeping the original files. I know exactly how men like him operate. They always keep the trump card in their own pocket. Where? Julian asked, looking up. Where would he hide the originals? At that farmhouse, Richard said. In that massive barn he keeps locked up in the backyard. That's where he's hiding the cash. The tax logs, the offshore account passwords. It's all sitting right there. If we destroy that folder, we destroy their entire case. Without physical evidence, the rest of it is nothing but hearsay. Julian stared back at his father. You want to break in? He's incredibly dangerous, Dad. Didn't you see how easily he dislocated my wrist? I'm not talking about breaking in, Richard said, his eyes wide and vacant with madness. I'm talking about burning it straight to the ground. I sat in front of my screen, watching the plan take shape between them. It was a completely foolish, desperate act, born out of pure panic. They honestly believed fire could wash away their crimes. They thought that by burning my barn, they could burn the truth. I need you to call Razor, Richard ordered. Razor? Julian froze. The drug dealer, the gang enforcer I owe money to. Call him, Richard commanded. Tell him I'm willing to pay double to wipe out your debt. Tell him I have a job for him. A very simple job. A match and a can of gasoline. I leaned back in my chair. I could have easily called the police right then. I could have handed over the recording of them plotting arson, but I didn't. I wanted to see exactly how low they could sink. I wanted to watch them dig their own graves with their own hands. 2 hours later, a black cargo van pulled up right at the edge of my farm property, hiding deep in the shadows of the tree line. I switched my monitor over to the perimeter security cameras. 3 men stepped out of the vehicle, dressed entirely in black clothing, walking with the distinct, arrogant swagger of thugs who survived on violence. I recognized the man leading the pack from old files in the intelligence networks. Razor, a mid-level enforcer for a local street gang. He was a massive, scarred brute who wasn't particularly bright. Richard and Julian were sitting inside a cheap rental car parked half a mile down the road. They were far too cowardly to do the dirty work themselves, choosing to watch from a safe distance as their hired muscle approached my fence. I didn't turn on the floodlights, and I didn't release the hounds. I simply let them approach. Razor and his 2 associates clipped straight through the wire fencing. They carried heavy red plastic gas cans through the tall weeds, the pungent chemical smell of gasoline drifting down the wind. They marched directly toward the barn that housed my Rolls-Royce and my entire archive. They reached the heavy barn doors. Razor pulled out a crowbar, but just as he was preparing to wedge it into the lock, he stopped dead in his tracks. He shined his flashlight directly onto the wood panel. A plate was mounted there. It was small, made of solid brass. It wasn't a standard sign warning about a vicious dog or telling trespassers they would be shot. It was a military unit crest, the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Directly beneath the crest, a cold line of steel-stamped text was engraved. Colonel Arthur Vance, U.S. Army. Razor froze completely, slowly lowering his flashlight. He stared at the brass plate, stared at the barn, and then frantically scanned the dark woods surrounding them with pure terror in his eyes. "Hold up," he hissed to his men. "What's wrong, boss?" one of the thugs asked. "Let's light it up." Razor grabbed the thug by his collar, violently slamming him against the barn wall. "Can you not read?" Razor's voice was audibly trembling with an intense, sudden fear. "It says Vance! Arthur Vance!" "So what?" the thug muttered, confused. "So what?" Razor gasped, fighting for breath. "My uncle served under Vance in Panama. He told me the stories. This isn't some old mechanic. This is death itself. We are standing directly inside his kill zone right now." Razor looked around the dark woods in pure panic. He suddenly realized that the unnatural silence in the trees wasn't a coincidence at all. He realized that a man like Vance had known they were coming 10 minutes ago. "Drop the cans," Razor ordered frantically. "Fall back right now. Get the hell out of here." "But the money?" the other man tried to argue. "Give them their money back," Razor snarled through gritted teeth. "I'm not dying for a couple grand. Move!" They turned and sprinted away in pure panic. When they reached the edge of the road, headlights came blinding toward them. It was the rental car. Richard and Julian had gotten impatient waiting and had driven closer to check on the progress. Julian rolled down his window, screaming to ask why they were running and demanding to know why there wasn't a fire yet, telling them to get back there and do it. Razor stopped running, staring directly at Julian. He looked down at the man who had marched him straight into a death trap without a single warning. "You set us up," Razor said, taking long strides toward the vehicle. "What?" Julian stammered. "No, just go finish the job." Razor reached his massive arms straight through the open car window. He grabbed Julian tightly by his tie, violently dragging half of his body out of the vehicle through the frame. "You sent me to hit a colonel?" Razor roared, his voice shaking with pure fury. "You sent me to assassinate the ghost? You trying to get me killed?" "I didn't know!" Julian shrieked, clawing at the hand. "Let go of me!" Razor didn't let go. He yanked the car door open, dragging Julian's entire body onto the dirt road. Julian scrambled onto his hands and knees, trying desperately to crawl away, but Razor was much faster and infinitely stronger. "You're gonna pay for the risk you put on my life," Razor growled low, raising a foot heavy with a thick combat boot. "No, please," Julian wailed, covering his head. "Don't hit the face." Razor didn't aim for the face. He aimed much lower. He brought his boot down with tremendous force, stamping directly onto Julian's right leg just above the ankle. The sound that followed echoed through the dark road like a thick dry branch, snapping violently in the dead of winter, a sickening crack. Julian let out a horrific, high-pitched scream that sounded like a dying animal, the sound piercing straight through the night sky. He rolled frantically in the dirt, clutching his shattered leg in absolute agony. Richard sat in the driver's seat, frozen solid by pure, unadulterated terror. He instantly locked all the car doors. He didn't step out of the vehicle to rescue his son. He just stared blankly straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a death lock. Razor leaned close to the driver's side window, staring directly down at Richard. "Tell the colonel we didn't know," Razor said coldly. "Tell him we're sorry and tell him we already took out the trash for him." Razor spat a thick glob of saliva onto the windshield. He gestured to his men and they ran back to their cargo van, slamming on the gas and fleeing the scene in a cloud of dust and the foul stench of panic. I witnessed every single second of it from my study. I took a sip of my water and picked up the microphone connected to the massive PA speakers mounted on the outside of the barn. "Richard," I said. My voice boomed violently through the dark woods, heavily amplified, sounding like an absolute judgment handed down from a god. Richard shuddered violently in his seat, looking around the dark road in pure horror. "I'm giving you exactly 10 seconds to get the hell off my property," I commanded. "Or the next thing that snaps won't just be a leg." Richard didn't hesitate for a single second. He didn't even cast a glance toward his own child lying in the dirt, screaming. He slammed the car into reverse, backing up violently and smashing right into a wooden fence post. Then he threw it into drive and floored the accelerator. He abandoned Julian. He left his own child with a shattered leg, rolling around on the freezing ground in agonizing pain, just to save his own skin. I watched the red taillights vanish completely into the dark night. I let out a heavy sigh, stood up, and headed toward the door. I couldn't just leave Julian out there in the dirt. I am not a monster. I stepped out into the pitch-black night, my hounds trotting quietly at my sides. Julian was still sobbing uncontrollably. He raised his head and saw me standing directly over him, my body casting a massive silhouette against the moonlight. "Please," he whimpered weakly, begging for mercy. "Please help me." He left me. He just completely abandoned me. I looked down at him with utter contempt. "I know," I said. "He's always been that kind of man, Julian. Always." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I have a trespasser on my farm property," I told the emergency dispatcher. "It looks like he broke his leg. Send an ambulance down here and send the police while you're at it." I hung up the phone and crouched down beside Julian. "You tried to burn my house down," I whispered softly. "I'm sorry," Julian wailed, crying like a child. "I'm so incredibly sorry. I didn't want to. He forced me to do it." I stood back up. "Violence is a tool, Julian," I said, "but if you don't know how to use it, it will eventually turn around and destroy you." I turned my back and walked right back to the farmhouse, leaving him out there entirely alone to wait for the wail of the sirens. The fire never started. My secrets were entirely safe, and the Sterling family was no longer just financially bankrupt. Their actual bloodline was completely fractured. A father who abandoned his son, and a son who would eventually betray his father. The trap had tightened completely shut, and they had absolutely nowhere left to run. I watched the red GPS tracking dot move rapidly across the tablet screen. The dot representing Richard Sterling wasn't heading toward a hospital to save his son, and it wasn't driving toward a police station to turn himself in. It was heading toward a self-storage facility on the outskirts of the city before driving straight toward a rundown private airstrip right along the coastline. I sat in my study, holding my water glass and shaking my head. A father with even a shred of human decency left in his soul would have turned that car right around. He would have been kneeling at my front gate, begging me to save his bleeding child. Julian had been lying in the dirt with a shattered bone, screaming in agonizing pain until the ambulance I called finally arrived. But Richard didn't care at all. In his twisted mind, Julian was already a casualty of war. Julian was a liability, and Richard Sterling was a survivor who intended to live. The security footage from the motel showed me exactly what he did before fleeing. He only went back into that room for 3 minutes, just long enough to rip open the lining of his suitcase and pull out stacks of hidden cash. It was his escape fund, his getaway money. He didn't leave a single dollar for his son. He didn't even bother to leave a note. He took the cash, grabbed his passport, and fled into the night. I picked up the phone. "Elena, I'm tracking him right now, sir," Elena replied. "He's heading for the Northfield private runway. We intercepted a call he made to a private charter pilot. He offered $50,000 in cash for an immediate flight to Belize." "Is the pilot compliant?" I asked. "The pilot is one of our people," Elena said. "We bought out that specific charter company an hour ago. The plane is already sitting on the tarmac, but the engines aren't warmed up yet." "Perfect," I said. "Let him walk all the way up to the boarding stairs. I want him to taste what freedom feels like right before it gets ripped away from him." I stood up and walked outside to the Rolls-Royce, where the driver already had the door held open for me. "To the airport," I ordered. "Step on it. I don't want to miss the moment he tries to take off." The drive took exactly 20 minutes. The night was pitch black, without a single shred of light in the sky. The private airfield was nothing but a desolate stretch of cracked concrete and overgrown weeds, completely dark except for a single strobe light flashing on top of a small hangar. The ocean wind howled across the tarmac, carrying the sharp, salty smell of seawater mixed with aviation fuel. I saw Richard's rental car parked crookedly right against the chain-link fence. The driver's side door was left wide open, showing how frantic he had been to escape. Then I caught sight of him sprinting across the tarmac. He was clutching a heavy canvas duffel bag to his chest, his suit jacket flapping wildly in the wind. He looked like an absolute madman, charging toward a small, twin-engine Cessna sitting at the very end of the runway. He rushed up to the side of the aircraft, pounding his fists frantically against the cabin door, screaming into the wind that he had arrived with the cash and demanding that they leave right now. The cabin door stayed completely shut. The propellers didn't spin an inch. The cockpit remained entirely dark and silent. Richard took 2 steps back, looking around the empty tarmac in pure panic, screaming to ask if anyone was in there, yelling that they had a deal. Suddenly, floodlights exploded into life. 4 massive truck-mounted LED spotlights surrounded the aircraft from all 4 directions, illuminating the tarmac until it looked as bright as day. The glare was blinding, harsh, and utterly ruthless. Richard let out a sharp shriek, instinctively raising his hands to shield his eyes from the light. The canvas duffel bag slipped from his grip and hit the concrete, the zipper bursting open and sending stacks of $100 bills spilling across the ground. The wind immediately caught several bills, swirling them away like dead leaves into the surrounding darkness. I stepped out from the shadows, slowly walking right into the center of the massive ring of light. The wind battered against my tie, but I didn't blink an inch, walking until I was standing exactly 10 feet away from him. "Going somewhere, Richard?" I asked. Richard lowered his hands, squinting through the glare. The second his eyes registered exactly who was standing there, his shoulders completely collapsed. He looked at the aircraft, then looked back at me, whispering hoarsely that I was everywhere. "I own the plane, Richard," I told him flatly. "I own the fuel. I own the very asphalt you are standing on right now. You have absolutely nowhere left to run. The FBI will be here in exactly 5 minutes. They have the forensic audits, and they have the witness testimonies. You are going to rot to death inside a federal prison." Richard dropped straight down onto his knees on the concrete, grabbing a handful of cash from the ground and holding it up toward me, weeping. He begged me to take the 200 grand, telling me to take all of it as long as I let him go, crying that he had a boat waiting for him in Mexico and just needed to leave. He begged me for mercy, saying we were both fathers. I glanced down at the cash, then looked back at him with an intense, deep disgust. "We are not both fathers," I said, my voice cold as ice. "A real father protects his child. I was the one who called the ambulance for your son tonight, while you left him in the dirt to die. You let his leg get shattered and ran away. You aren't a father, Richard. You're a parasite." The cash slipped through Richard's fingers. He finally realized that bribery was completely useless against me. His eyes began darting around frantically, trying desperately to find a new angle, looking for a new scapegoat he could throw under the bus to save himself. "It wasn't my idea," he suddenly blurted out. I raised an eyebrow. "What wasn't your idea?" I asked. "The fraud!" Richard's words came tumbling out faster and faster as he desperately tried to shift the blame. "The embezzlement, the offshore accounts. It was all Julian. He's the one with the gambling addiction. He's the one who needed the money. I just signed the papers. I was trying to protect him. I'm an old man, Arthur. I don't even know how to use a computer. Julian orchestrated the entire thing." I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a small digital audio recorder, pressing the red record button. "Say that again," I said. Richard stared directly at the recorder. He saw it as a literal lifeline, a golden opportunity to trade his own son's life for a scrap of his own freedom. "If I tell you the truth," he asked, his voice trembling, "will you let me go? Will you let me get on that plane?" I looked down at him. I didn't smile, and I didn't make a single promise. I simply held the recorder a fraction closer to his face. "The truth is the only currency I accept, Richard," I said. Richard scrambled onto his hands and knees, leaning in close to the recorder. To make absolutely sure his voice was caught clearly, he confessed loudly and explicitly, shouting that Julian Sterling was the mastermind behind the entire scam, claiming his son had forged his signatures on the tax filings, set up the shell companies in Panama, and stolen the money from the charity foundation. He cried that Julian had forced him into it, threatening to expose him if he didn't help. He wailed that he was innocent, a victim of elder abuse, and that Julian was the criminal they were looking for. He paused to catch his breath before driving the final nail into his son's coffin. "And the arson tonight," he added frantically. "He's the one who hired those thugs to burn your barn down. I tried to stop him. I begged him not to do it. But he's completely out of control. He's a dangerous lunatic." I pressed the stop button on the recorder with a distinct click. I had it all. The full confession, the total betrayal, perfectly documented. He had sold out his own flesh and blood just for a seat on a flight that was never going to take off. "Thank you, Richard," I said, placing the recorder back inside my pocket. "Now let me go," Richard begged, reaching his hands out. "Give me the keys. Let me leave. I gave you exactly what you wanted." I reached inside the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. "Here," I said, holding it out to him, "your plane ticket." Richard snatched the piece of paper straight from my hand, his trembling fingers frantically unfolding it. He was fully expecting to see a boarding pass or an official flight plan. Instead, he found himself staring at a printed screenshot of a text message. It was the message I had sent to the FBI exactly 5 minutes prior, stating that the target was located at Northfield Airport. that a full confession had been secured, and instructing them to move in. Richard's head snapped up, his face instantly turning pale as a sheet as he shrieked that I had lied to him. "I am a businessman, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping like heavy ice. "I negotiate deals, but I never once said I would actually let you get on that plane. What I said was that I wanted the truth, and you just gave it to me." "But I gave you Julian," he howled, a desperate feral sound ripping from his throat. "I handed you my own son." "Yes," I said, taking a deliberate step back into the shadows, as the wail of police sirens grew distinctly louder in the distance. "You certainly did, and that is exactly why you deserve everything that's coming to you. A man who sells out his own child isn't even worth the dirt under my boots." Richard lunged at me in a blind, chaotic frenzy, his fingers clawing wildly through the air as he tried to strangle me, screaming obscenities at the top of his lungs. I didn't even bother to take my hands out of my suit pockets. I simply took a slight step to the side. Richard caught nothing but empty air, tripped straight over his own canvas duffel bag, and slammed face first onto the hard concrete with a heavy thud. Before he could even begin to push himself up, 4 black SUVs tore onto the tarmac with a loud screech of brakes. Heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, training their assault rifles on him, their bulletproof vests bearing the bright yellow initials of the FBI. Richard curled himself into a tight ball on the pavement, burying his head in his hands, weeping hysterically and screaming for them not to shoot, begging them to believe he was unarmed and fully willing to cooperate. I watched them secure his hands tightly behind his back with heavy zip ties. I watched them haul him to his feet like a dead animal. He cast one final look in my direction, but all the hatred had completely vanished from his eyes, leaving behind nothing but an absoluto, hollow emptiness. He had been reduced to a walking corpse, an empty shell of a man. I turned my back on the scene and walked calmly toward my car. The wind continued to howl across the tarmac, but the air felt entirely clean now, as if the bitter breeze had finally swept away the foul stench of the Sterling family's corruption. I slid into the back seat of the Rolls-Royce. Elena turned around from the front passenger seat, asking if I had gotten what we came for. I tapped the breast pocket where the audio recorder was resting, confirming that he had spilled everything. I noted that he had buried Julian so incredibly deep that the two of them would never see each other outside of a prison wall again, and that he had managed to completely bury himself in the process. "What do you want to do with the recording?" she asked. "Keep it," I instructed. "Save it for the trial. And I want it played for Julian. I want him to hear the exact sound of his father trading his life away just to save himself. I want him to realize that at the end of the day, in the eyes of the man he spent his entire life trying to please, he was worth absolutely nothing." "Drive," I ordered. The car glided smoothly away from the curb, leaving the flashing emergency lights and the desperate fading screams far behind in the darkness. It was brutal, and it was entirely cold-blooded, but it was necessary. I pulled out my phone and looked at a photograph of Clara. I had sworn a solemn oath to protect her, and tonight I had permanently neutralized the final threat. The Sterling dynasty was dead, and I was the one who had dug the grave with my own hands. But the night wasn't completely finished yet. There was still one final act left to play out. The public ledger needed to be balanced. At this exact moment, the truth didn't just need to be bared before a court of law. It needed to be laid bare before my daughter's soul. I closed my eyes and let the dark night carry me back home. I was exhausted, but it was a deeply comforting kind of fatigue. The profound weariness that only comes after surviving a long, brutal campaign that you know you have entirely won. The executive boardroom of Sterling Real Estate had witnessed plenty of apex predators over its 40-year history. It had seen hostile takeovers and ice-cold corporate standoffs, but it had never once witnessed a one-sided slaughter like the one that was about to unfold. I sat at the absolute head of the long table, the dark obsidian surface reflecting my calm, expressionless face. Seated all around me were 20 members of the board of directors. These were the exact same men and women who had worshipped Richard Sterling like a god when the stock prices were soaring, and now they were practically salivating at the chance to tear his legacy apart, just to protect their own dividends. A dead silence filled the room, broken only by the faint, steady hum of the climate control system. Now that I owned the building, the utilities had been fully restored. Everyone was waiting. We weren't waiting on a quarterly financial report. We were waiting for the absolute last remnant of the old regime. The heavy double doors were pushed open. Julian Sterling hobbled into the room. He looked like an entirely different species compared to the arrogant prince who had mocked me at the holiday dinner table. He was completely broken. A thick, heavy plaster cast ran from his right shin all the way down to his ankle, and he was leaning his entire body weight onto a pair of aluminum crutches. Click, drag, click, drag! The sound echoed through the vast, silent room, sounding incredibly pathetic and hollow. A thick piece of medical gauze was still taped across his nose. His face was pale, and his jaw was covered in dark stubble. He was wearing an off-the-rack suit that had clearly been purchased from a cheap discount store, as every single one of his custom-tailored designer clothes had already been seized by the asset recovery teams. He limped all the way down to the opposite end of the conference table, gripping the back of the executive chair tightly just to stabilize his balance. He scanned the room, desperately searching for a single friendly face. He found absolutely nothing. Every single board member either kept their eyes glued down to their tablets or stared blankly out the window, refusing to make eye contact. They could smell the stench of total failure on him. Julian cleared his throat, his voice sounding incredibly wet and ragged. "Members of the board," he began, his tone visibly shaking. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know the current situation looks incredibly bleak. I know my father has been arrested, and it is an absolute tragedy. But I want to assure every single person in this room that I am here today to take control. I am going to guide this ship straight out of the storm." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together over my chest. I watched him spin his lies, finding it fascinating on a highly twisted level. He actually genuinely believed he still had a fighting chance. He truly believed that because his father had been destroyed, the crown automatically devolved onto his head by birthright. "My father made mistakes," Julian continued, attempting to force a shred of confidence back into his voice. "He grew old, and his judgment failed him. But I am not my father. I represent the absolute future of sterling real estate. I have a grand vision for this firm. With your backing, I can completely rebuild our reputation. I am asking the board to immediately appoint me as the permanent CEO." He forced a smile across his face, a highly disturbing, desperate grimace. I didn't say a single word. I simply gave a tiny, barely perceptible nod toward the side of the room. The service door slid open. Clara walked inside. The entire energy in the room shifted instantly. If Julian looked like a common beggar, Clara looked like an absolute queen. She was wearing a sharply tailored, pristine white power suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, professional bun that left her face completely exposed. The deep bruising from where Julian had struck her had been completely covered by foundation, leaving behind nothing but an icy, steel-like determination in her eyes. She didn't look in my direction at all, walking straight to the presentation podium positioned next to the projection screen. Julian's fake smile froze instantly on his face. He stammered out her name, asking what she was doing here, calling her sweetheart, and telling her that this was a confidential executive meeting and that she should go home. Clara looked directly at him. She didn't see a husband anymore. She saw an absolute stranger. "I am already home, Julian," she said, her voice amplified by the podium microphone, echoing sharply across the boardroom. "This entire company was built on a foundation of pure fraud, and today we are cleaning house." She pressed a button on the media console, and the massive screen behind her flashed to life. It didn't display a spreadsheet or a financial graph. It showed an audio waveform. Julian stared at it in utter confusion, asking what it was. The truth? Clara said flatly. She hit the play button, and a voice boomed through the high-definition speakers, a voice that was absolutely unmistakable. It was Richard Sterling, his words howling through the rushing wind of the airport runway from the recording I had secured the night before. It was Julian Sterling! Richard's voice blasted across the room through the static. My son, he orchestrated the entire scam. He forged my signature. He stole the money. He forced me to go along with it. One of Julian's aluminum crutches slipped from his grip, hitting the marble floor with a loud metallic clatter. He grabbed onto the edge of the obsidian table with both hands, every single drop of color draining from his face instantly. That's a lie! He screamed hysterically, his voice cracking completely. That's a fabrication! My father would never say those things. The recording continued to blast through the speakers, Richard's voice shrieking that his son was the real criminal, the one they were looking for, adding that Julian had even hired thugs to burn my barn down, while he begged him to stop. Clara hit the pause button. The silence that settled over the boardroom was 100 times heavier than before. The board members were staring directly at Julian with an open, undisguised disgust. A father who sold out his son, and a son who tried to frame his father, it was a literal den of vipers. Julian shook his head frantically from side to side, whispering in pure disbelief that his father had thrown him under the bus, abandoning him in the dirt to save himself while pinning the entire crime on his head. Clara stepped out from behind the podium. She wasn't finished with him yet. Your father is certainly a liar, Julian, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. We all know he was fully complicit in the fraud, but there is one thing he told the truth about. You are a thief. 他再次按下按钮, and the screen shifted to display a series of bank statements. This is the account for the Vance Family Charitable Foundation, Clara said, pointing directly at the digital display. Bingqi Jishi are the withdrawal logs belonging to Julian Sterling. He stole exactly $500,000 directly from funds allocated for orphanages and homeless shelters. Julian looked like he was about to physically vomit. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. Where did you spend that money? Clara demanded, her voice rising. Did you invest it? Did you save it? No. She clicked the remote control again, and dozens of surveillance photographs exploded across the screen. Photos of Julian gambling away fortunes at high-stakes tables. Photos of Julian and Tiffany laughing on the deck of a luxury yacht. Photos of Julian handing stacks of cash directly to illegal bookmakers. Finally, a video file began to play. It was a video of Julian sitting in a bar with his friends, drinking and laughing loudly. She's my goose that lays the golden eggs. Julian's recorded voice boomed through the room, his face flushed bright red from alcohol. As long as I keep her happy, I never have to work a single day for the rest of my life. She's honestly pathetic, but her checkbook is absolutely beautiful. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the entire boardroom. Julian stared blankly at the screen, watching his filthy soul get stripped entirely bare in front of everyone. He was forced to watch the absolute end of his own pathetic masquerade. Clara shut off the screen. The room plunged into darkness for a split second before the overhead lights flashed back on. She walked straight over to Julian, stopping exactly 2 feet away from him, close enough to smell the sour, bitter stench of fear radiating off his skin. You called me pathetic, she said softly, her voice carrying a terrifying calm. You said I was a goose. You genuinely believed you could exploit me and then discard me like a piece of garbage. Julian stared back at her, tears actively streaming down his face, mixing with the cold sweat on his cheeks. Clara, please, he whimpered in a low moan. I was drunk. I didn't mean any of it. We can fix this. I love you. Clara reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick, heavy white envelope, slamming it hard against the chest of his cheap suit with a loud slap. You don't love anyone but yourself, Julian, she said. Those are divorce papers. I officially filed them first thing this morning. Yingji Fanyin Jusha. Julian tried to grab her hand, crying out that he needed her, and that he had absolutely nothing left. Clara snapped her hand back instantly, treating his touch as if it were a piece of white-hot iron. "You're exactly right," she told him, her eyes locking onto his. "You have absolutely nothing left. I have already frozen every single one of our joint accounts. I invoked the morality clause in our prenuptial agreement. You get nothing. No alimony, no asset division, and no house." She looked him up and down, her gaze full of pure disdain. "And I am taking my name back," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "I'm no longer Mrs. Sterling. That name represents nothing but cowardice and shame. I am Ms. Vance, and this entire company now falls under the direct management of the Vance Holding Group." She turned around to face the table. "I move for the immediate termination of Julian Sterling from all corporate positions within this firm," she said, her voice clear and absolute. "All in favor, raise your hands." Every single hand in the boardroom went up. Even the older board members, men who had watched Julian grow up from a boy, raised their hands without hesitation. Julian looked around the room, staring at the canopy of raised arms. It looked like a forest closing in to deliver his final judgment. He turned his head toward the head of the table, looking directly at me. He wailed my name, begging me to help him, calling me a man of honor, and pleading with me not to let them do this to him. I slowly stood up, fastening the button of my suit jacket. "Honor is earned, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his panic. "You spent your entire life overdrawing your credit, and now the bill is due." I turned my attention to the security guards waiting at the door. "Get him out of here." The guards stepped forward. Julian tried to scramble backward, but his crutches lost traction on the highly polished, waxed floor. He went down hard, collapsing right onto his broken leg, and let out a horrific, piercing shriek. Nobody stepped in to help him. The guards grabbed him by the arms and hauled him up bluntly. He was crying like a baby now, a completely broken, thoroughly ruined shell of a man. As they dragged him toward the exit, he shrieked for Clara, screaming for his father, begging anyone to help him. Clara didn't look back. She stood perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the projection screen where the emblem of the Vance Holding Group had just replaced the Sterling family crest. When the double doors slammed shut, cutting off the sound of his pathetic screaming, the air in the room instantly felt cleaner. The infection had finally been cut out. I looked over at my daughter. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline rush that comes when you finally cut the rope that's been choking you for years. I walked over to her side and placed a hand gently on her shoulder, telling her softly that it was over. Clara looked up at me, her eyes wet with tears, but she was smiling. "He has nothing left," she whispered. "No," I replied. "He still has his life, which is a mercy he doesn't even deserve. But he lost everything he actually cared about. He lost his audience." I turned back to face the board of directors. They were staring at us anxiously, terrified that they might be the next ones on the chopping block. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice echoing across the obsidian table, "today is a new day. The Sterling era is officially over. We are going to rebuild this company, but we are going to build it on absolute financial transparency and actual talent. Anyone who has a problem with that can follow Julian Sterling right out that door." Nobody moved an inch. "Good," I said. I looked out the window at the city spreading below. Somewhere down on those streets, Julian was about to be dumped onto the sidewalk. He had no car, no money, no father to bail him out, and no wife to comfort him. He had finally become the exact word he used to mock me, a completely irrelevant nobody. But unlike me, he didn't possess the strength to rise from the ashes. The public trial was over. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was an absolute lifetime of complete insignificance. Now only the legal formalities remained. A prison cell was waiting for them, and I intended to personally ensure that cell was incredibly small and very, very cold. The elevator ride down from the boardroom was dead silent, but it was a heavy, loaded silence, like the quiet that settles over a landscape after a bomb explodes and the dust finally clears. Clara stood right beside me. She kept her head held high, but I could still see the slight trembling in her hands. She had just personally dismantled the last few years of her life in front of 20 strangers. She had cut out the toxic tumor that had been growing inside her heart. When the elevator doors slid open in the ground floor lobby, the scene was absolute chaos. The quiet, dignified elegance that usually defined the Sterling building had been completely replaced by the ruthless efficiency of federal law enforcement. The FBI agents I called in were everywhere, wearing their blue windbreakers with the bright yellow lettering, carrying boxes overflowing with confidential files, and locking down every single exit. Right in the middle of the lobby, the final act of the tragedy was playing out. Julian Sterling was sitting on a bench near the security desk, slouching completely over and clutching his broken leg tightly. He looked like a ragged marionette whose strings had been completely slashed, weeping softly in a muffled sob that was drowned out by the noise of the lobby. Right then, the revolving doors spun open, and the real star of the show arrived. 2 federal agents marched Richard Sterling into the building, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He was still wearing the wrinkled suit from the airport, looking completely manic. His hair stood up like wild weeds, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, searching desperately for an escape route that simply didn't exist. The moment his eyes landed on Julian sitting on the bench, he stopped dead in his tracks. He tried to lunge at his own son, not to offer comfort, but to scream at him. "This is all your fault," Richard roared, his voice completely hoarse. "You told them everything. You pathetic, cowardly weakling." Julian raised his head, his eyes red and swollen. "You were the one who abandoned me first," Julian roared right back at him. "You left me in the dirt with a broken leg and ran off with the cash. You have zero right to talk to me about cowardice." An agent gave Richard a firm shove, forcing him down onto the bench right next to his son. It was a poetic image. A father and son who had formed an alliance out of pure greed, now reunited by captivity. I stepped out of the elevator bank with Clara walking right by my side. The sharp click of our footsteps echoed off the marble floor, cutting through the chaotic noise of the lobby. The agents caught sight of me and nodded in respect, knowing exactly who I was, and that I was the master architect behind this entire destruction. I walked until I was standing exactly 5 feet away from the bench, looking down at the 2 men who used to rule this city, or at least believed they did. Richard raised his head to look up at me. His face was a twisted mask of intense hatred and deep, profound confusion. "Why?" he gasped out hoarsely. I paused for a moment, letting the question hang heavily in the air. "Why did you do this?" Richard demanded, pressing for an answer. "Why the disguise? Why drive that piece of junk truck? Why wear those cheap clothes? If you had just told us who you were from the very beginning, none of this would have happened. We would have respected you. We would have welcomed you. We would have been the best business partners you could ask for." Julian nodded his head frantically, wiping the mucus from his nose. "Yes," he wailed. "If we knew you had that kind of money, Arthur, we would have treated you like an absolute king. We would have given you the head of the table." I felt a cold wave of laughter ripple through my chest, but I kept my face perfectly expressionless. I glanced over at Clara. She was looking down at them with a gaze of pure, unadulterated pity. I took a step closer, ensuring they would hear every single syllable. I wanted to burn this lesson directly into their minds so they could replay it over and over during the long, freezing nights behind bars that were waiting for them. "Do you honestly believe that my money defines who I am?" I asked, keeping my voice low and perfectly even. "Of course it does," Richard spat back. "Money is everything. Money is power. Money is respect. By hiding your wealth, you were hiding your value. You set us up. You acted like a country hick just to trick us into treating you like one." I slowly shook my head. "I didn't set you up, Richard," I told him. "I simply gave you a test." I looked around the vast lobby. The receptionists, the guards, the federal agents, everyone was listening in total silence. "When my wife, Martha, passed away, I made a solemn vow," I said. "I promised myself I would live an authentic life. In my past world, the world where high finance and black operations intersect, everyone wears a mask. Everyone wants to extract something from you. I simply wanted to know if there was anyone left in this world who would evaluate a man's soul, rather than the size of his wallet. I turned my eyes onto Julian. When Clara brought you home, I didn't run a background check on your bank accounts, I said. I looked at your eyes. I watched how you held the door open for her, and I listened to how you spoke to the servers at restaurants. I saw the cracks in your character even back then, but I truly believed you just needed a little guidance. I thought that if I showed you genuine kindness, you would return it in kind. I gave you a humble father-in-law. I gave you a man who would help you mend your fences and mow your lawns. I gave you an opportunity to show basic human decency to an old man who had nothing to offer you but his time and his wisdom. And what did you do with that opportunity? I raised my volume slightly, letting the words echo off the high ceiling. You mocked me. You made me eat my meals in the kitchen. You laughed at my clothes. You treated me like a stray dog you couldn't wait to see die. Because you looked like a completely irrelevant broke nobody, Julian muttered under his breath. I am a broke nobody, I suddenly roared, the sound booming like thunder under the rafters. Julian flinched, tucking his chin into his chest in pure terror. I am a broke nobody, I repeated, dropping my voice low but doubling the intense pressure in the room. Strip away the assets attached to my name, and I am just a flesh and blood human being. And that is exactly the entire point. If you don't know how to show respect to a janitor cleaning the floors, you don't deserve a shred of respect from a CEO. I turned my focus back to Richard. You said that if you knew I had money, you would have treated me like a king, I said. I believe you. You absolutely would have kissed my ring. You would have laughed at my terrible jokes. You would have poured me your most expensive vintage wine instead of dumping it down my daughter's front. But that isn't respect, Richard. That's a transaction. That's prostitution. You don't care about actual people. You only care about the utility they can provide for you. I looked over at Clara, who was standing tall, a glint of tears shining in her eyes. My daughter fell in love with a mask, I said, pointing a finger down at Julian. She genuinely believed you were a prince, but the exact second the money stopped flowing and the lights went out, the mask slipped off, revealing nothing but a terrified, greedy little boy underneath. I turned my gaze back down to both of them. I didn't hide my identity to entrap you, I told them. I hid my identity to give you a chance to be human beings, and you failed completely. Richard lowered his eyes, staring down at the tips of his shoes. All of his fighting spirit was entirely gone. He knew I was right. He knew that his own wretched character had personally engineered his total destruction. I gestured to the lead FBI agent. Take them away, I ordered. The air in this city is already bad enough without them polluting it any longer. Bao Zheng Zai Fang Hu Fuli, the Te Gong Wei Le Guolai, ordering them to stand up. Richard struggled to his feet, looking incredibly old and fragile. The arrogance that had supported his spine for decades had completely shattered into dust. He hung his head low, shuffling his feet forward. Julian tried to stand up, but his broken leg couldn't support any weight. 2 agents had to grab him under his armpits, dragging his body bluntly across the floor. He shrieked in pain, complaining about his leg and crying that they were hurting him. You should have thought about that before you sent men to burn down a house with people still inside it, the agent replied, completely devoid of sympathy. They marched the 2 of them toward the glass exit. I watched their retreating backs, looking at the expensive suits they thought made them superior. Now those clothes were nothing more than costumes for a tragedy. They reached the revolving doors. Through the glass, I could see a police van waiting outside. Its back doors were wide open like a giant black mouth, ready to swallow them whole. The media had arrived. Camera flashes exploded like a lightning storm, and reporters began shouting sharp, piercing questions, asking if Richard had really embezzled charity funds, and demanding to know if Julian had actually beaten his wife. Richard desperately buried his face into his shoulder, while Julian could only sob louder. I watched the agents pack them into the back of the van, where the metal benches looked cold and hard. Just before the heavy doors slammed shut, Julian turned back one last time. Through the barrier of the glass doors and the cracks in the sea of flashing lights, His eyes found mine. He mouthed a single word. Please. I didn't even blink. I didn't look away. I just watched silently until the heavy metal doors closed with a resounding thud. That was it. That was the sound of a book slamming shut. The van drove off, followed by a long convoy of police cruisers, their sirens fading into the wind. A deep quiet settled over the lobby. The employees stood frozen in place, completely unsure of what to do next. I turned to Clara, who was staring at the empty space where the van had just been. Her face was still a bit pale. I asked her gently if she was okay. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the wrinkles on her white blazer. I don't know, she admitted honestly. I feel light, like I've been carrying a backpack full of rocks my entire life, and someone just cut the straps. But at the same time, I feel a little empty. I nodded. That's completely normal, sweetheart, I told her. You're mourning, not for him, but for the years you lost and for the love you thought you had. She looked up at me. He never actually loved me, did he? He only loved my obedience, or what I could do for him. I took her hand. It was cold, but her grip was tight. He's a man who lost the capacity to love, Clara, I said. He's a hollow shell. Don't mourn the emptiness. Fill it. Fill it with the work you love, and fill it with people who actually care about you. I looked around the lobby at the employees watching us. Fill it with this place, I said, pointing around the building. You have a lot of work to do, Ms. Vance. This company needs a leader who knows the difference between price and value. Clara looked around the room. She saw the receptionist, the security guards, the junior analysts. They weren't looking at her with fear. They were looking at her with hope. They knew she was the one who exposed the corruption. They knew she was the one who saved the ship from sinking. She squared her shoulders, a hint of color finally returning to her cheeks. You're right, she said. I have a meeting to finish. She gave my hand a firm squeeze. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. Thank you for saving me, even when I didn't want to be saved. I kissed her forehead. That's what fathers do, I said. She turned and walked toward the elevators with a powerful stride, her heels clicking on the marble in a steady rhythmic echo. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the head of the house. I watched her until the elevator doors closed. Then I turned toward the exit. My work here was done. The wolf had finished the hunt. The flock was safe. I stepped out into the cool night air. The city was still humming along, cars honking, people rushing to dinner. Life goes on. I walked over to the Rolls-Royce, and the driver held the door open for me, asking where to. Home, I said. Back to the farmhouse. I need to feed the dogs and chop some wood. I need to get out of this suit and back into my flannel shirt. During the day, I was the billionaire Arthur Vance. But tonight, I just wanted to be Arthur, the old man living in the woods. Because it was that old man in the woods who won this war. That was who I really was. As the car glided smoothly away, I took one last look at the Sterling building. The lights were still blazing, but the rotten roots had been completely ripped out. Justice, I thought, is a heavy sledgehammer. But sometimes it's the only tool that can get the job done. 我闭上眼睛, letting the low hum of the engine lull me into a long, overdue, yet deeply alert peace. The legal verdict had been handed down, but the emotional healing would take time, and I would be right there with her, every single step of the way. Destroying the Sterling Empire happened in a flash, but clearing the wreckage was a long, slow grind. For the next 6 months, I barely spent any time at the farmhouse. I was at the building every single day, overseeing the dismantling of their legacy. The very first thing to go was the sign. I stood outside the police tape in Manhattan, watching a crane lower those massive golden letters, STERLING, from the top of the skyscraper. They were cut down one by one. When the letter S hit the concrete, it made a dull metallic thud that sounded exactly like a funeral toll. I had them melted down. Every single golden letter went into the furnace. The gold was sold, and every dime of the proceeds went straight into the charity foundation Julian had stolen from. It was a piece of poetic justice that gave me immense satisfaction. Inside the building, the atmosphere completely transformed. All the corporate sycophants who had enabled Richard and Julian were fired immediately. I didn't give them a dignified severance package. I gave them a cardboard box and 10 minutes to clear their desks. In their place, we brought in young, driven professionals who actually valued ethics. We restructured the entire operation. Sterling real estate was dead. From its ashes, the Clara Vance Architecture and Public Good Foundation was born. We completely flipped the business model. We stopped building hyper-luxury penthouses for billionaires and poured our resources into affordable housing and community centers. We used the liquidated assets from the Hamptons estate to build top-tier shelters for victims of domestic abuse. Every brick we laid was a testament to my daughter's rebirth. During those months, I watched Clara closely. I watched her shed the skin of a victim and grow a new bulletproof armor. At first, she was hesitant. She doubted herself. Every time she had to sign a massive check, she would instinctively look over at me for approval, but I never gave her the answers. I forced her to find them herself. I forced her to trust her own gut. Slowly, day by day, that hesitation vanished. The soft-spoken girl who used to bake beef Wellington to please a hypercritical family was completely gone. In her place stood a leader who could silence a chaotic boardroom with a single look. One evening, we hosted a gala to celebrate the official launch of the new foundation. The ballroom was packed with high society, but this time they weren't there to mock us. They were lining up just to shake Clara's hand. She was radiant in a black evening gown, standing tall with her shoulders back and her chin up. She navigated the Shark Tank of New York high society with the effortless grace of an apex predator. I stood by the bar, drinking a club soda and watching her work the room. That's when I saw a man approach her. I recognized the type instantly. His name was Bradley, a hedge fund manager known for being a smooth talker, though his bank account was mostly a bubble built on hot air. He had seen the news, knew Clara was single, and knew she was sitting on a massive fortune. He saw her as the perfect prey, a lonely, recently divorced woman desperate for comfort. I watched him slide up next to her, flashing a bright white smile. He lightly touched her forearm, a highly offensive gesture meant to fabricate a sense of intimacy. "Clara," his voice sounded greasy like it was covered in oil, "you look absolutely stunning tonight. I can't even begin to imagine how tough this year has been on you. Carrying a weight like this all by yourself, you must be completely exhausted." My muscles immediately tensed up. My instinct was to walk over right then and break the hand he was touching her with. But I stayed put. I wanted to see how the new Clara would handle a wolf in sheep's clothing. Clara didn't flinch. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then looked up at his face. Her expression was ice cold. "Hello, Bradley," she said, her voice completely detached. "I just wanted to offer my support," Bradley continued, leaning his body in closer. "When it comes to managing massive portfolios, I'm somewhat of an expert. If you ever need an advisor or just someone to take you out for a nice dinner to help you forget your troubles, let me know. I think we'd make a perfect power couple, Clara. You have the heart, and I have the financial mind." He gave a little wink. It was the exact same arrogant look Julian used to give. Clara smiled, but the warmth never reached her eyes. "That's an incredibly generous offer, Bradley," she said, "but I think you've made a severe miscalculation on two fronts." "Oh?" Bradley kept his smile locked in. "And what would those be?" "First," she said, smoothly brushing his hand off her arm like she was flicking away a dead fly, "you assume I'm looking for a partner. I'm not. I just permanently removed one parasite from my life, and I have absolutely no intention of adopting another." Bradley's smile stiffened. "I'm sorry, are you—" "Second," she cut him off, her voice as sharp as a razor blade, "you mentioned your financial mind. I had a background check run on every single person on the guest list tonight. I know your fund lost 40% this quarter. I know you're currently under investigation by the SEC for suspected insider trading, and I know you're 3 months behind on alimony payments to your second wife." Bradley went completely pale. He frantically looked around the room to see if anyone had overheard. "So," Clara said, taking a step forward and crowding into his personal space, "you aren't here to help me. You're looking for a lifeboat. But I am not a lifeboat, Bradley. I am the captain of this ship, and I do not allow rats to sneak on board. She took an elegant sip of her champagne. Now, if you'll excuse me, she said, her tone delivering an absolute dismissal. I have actual donors to speak with. Enjoy the appetizers, Bradley. They're free, unlike your advice. She turned her back and walked straight away, leaving Bradley standing there with his mouth wide open. I let out a low chuckle, raising my glass to her from across the ballroom. She caught my eye and gave me a quick wink. It wasn't an arrogant gesture, it was the salute of a fellow warrior. She had learned well. She didn't need my protection any more. She had become the nightmare that kept the hypocrites awake at night. Late that night, after the last guest had departed, we stood out on the balcony of the penthouse suite. The city lights were twinkling far below us. You went pretty savage on Bradley, I noted. Clara laughed, a genuine, joyful sound. He reminded me of Julian, she said. The entitlement, the fake charm. I promised myself I'd never fall into the same trap twice. I have a new standard now, Dad. And what standard is that? I asked. You, she said. If a man can't look me in the eye and tell me the absolute truth, he doesn't deserve a seat at my table. And if he thinks the most attractive thing about me is my money, he can get lost. I nodded, feeling an immense sense of pride, but also a deep exhaustion. The war was officially over. The enemy was entirely wiped out. My daughter was safe, powerful, and independent. My mission was complete. I think it's time, I said, looking out at the horizon. Time for what? Clara asked. Time to go home, I said. Clara looked at me. You are home, Dad. You can live here. You can have this penthouse. I shook my head. This is your world, Clara. A world made of glass, steel, and contracts. I cleared it out for you, but I don't belong here. I belong in the woods. I belong in the quiet. Why? She asked. You hold so much power right now. You could run this entire city. I placed my hands gently on her cheeks. Power is a heavy coat, baby girl, I told her. You put it on when it's freezing, and you wear it when you have to fight. But you don't sleep in it. If you wear it too long, you forget what your own skin feels like. I put on the suit for you, and I wore the watch for you. But underneath all of it, I'm just Arthur. And Arthur misses his dogs. Clara wrapped her arms around me, holding on tightly for a long time. She asked if I would come visit her, and I promised her I'd be there every single Sunday. I told her she had to come down to the farmhouse too, promising we'd eat barbecue off paper plates, talk about life, and never mention a single word about money. Early the next morning, I packed up my belongings. I took off that custom Italian suit, carefully folded it, and placed it in the deepest corner of the closet. I unbuckled the Patek Philippe, put it back into its velvet box, and locked it away in the safe. I pulled my corduroy jacket back on. It was soft, frayed at the edges, and smelled of wood smoke and cedar. I slipped into my jeans and my old work boots. Looking in the mirror, the billionaire had completely vanished. An ordinary old man stared back at me, but the look in his eyes was much lighter. The heavy burden had finally been lifted. I walked out to the garage. The Rolls-Royce Phantom was parked there, gleaming under the lights. I walked right past it, heading straight toward my rusty Chevy pickup. I patted its faded hood like an old friend and climbed into the cab. The engine coughed a few times before letting out a rough, heavy roar. It was an unrefined sound, but it was the sound of pure freedom. I drove out of the city, leaving the skyscrapers and the chaotic noise far behind. I watched the Sterling building shrink in my rearview mirror until it was nothing but a tiny black speck. The moment I hit the gravel road leading to my property, I rolled down the windows. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. My dogs heard the truck coming. They came sprinting to the main gate, their tails wagging like propellers, letting out pure, unreserved barks of joy. They didn't care about my bank account balance, and they didn't care about my social status. They loved me simply because I was home. I parked the truck and stepped out onto the dirt, taking a deep breath to fill my lungs with the crisp, clean air. I walked inside the cabin, and everything was exactly the way I had left it. The wood stove was cold, and my coffee mug was still sitting on the table. I started a fire, watching the flames dance, and sat down in my armchair. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had taken back my life, and I had taken back my family. Yet, as I sat there watching the hearth, a thought drifted into my mind, the survival instinct born from a lifetime of constant vigilance. Richard and Julian were behind bars, and their empire was completely destroyed. But hatred is an incredibly powerful fuel, and prison is a place where a man has nothing to do but sit, think, and plot. I remembered the look in Julian's eyes when the prison transport doors slammed shut. Yes, he was begging, but underneath that desperation there was something else hiding, a tiny spark of pure madness. And Richard, a man who would sell out his own flesh and blood just to save his own skin, would do absolutely anything to survive. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted phone. I didn't turn it off. I simply laid it down on the side table right next to me. Peace had returned. The birds were chirping and the wind was whispering through the trees. But I knew better than anyone that true peace is just an intermission between two wars. I closed my eyes and let myself rest, but I kept one ear tuned to the sounds outside. Because a wolf never truly sleeps, he just waits. And if the shadows ever moved again, or if the darkness ever tried to reach for my daughter, I was ready to fight. My name is Arthur Vance, and I am always watching. Outside the window, the snow was falling silently, covering the scars of the earth with a pristine white blanket. It had been exactly 1 year to the day since I walked out of the Sterling estate and stepped into the bitter winter night. But today, the air inside my farmhouse didn't carry the foul stench of social judgment or expensive perfume. The room was filled with the rich, savory aroma of sage, roasted garlic, and a turkey that had been slow roasting for 6 straight hours. I stood by the oven in my flannel shirt, opening the heavy door to baste the turkey with its own juices. The skin had turned a perfect, crispy, golden brown. It was absolutely flawless. I smiled to myself, remembering how just last year Richard had called my daughter's dinner cheap garbage, prodding at the meat with total disgust. Today there were no bitter critics in my kitchen. There was only family. Clara stood at the counter, chopping vegetables for a salad, humming a soft tune to herself. I hadn't heard her hum like that in 10 years. She was wearing jeans and a simple pullover sweater, her long hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She looked 10 years younger. The deep stress lines that Julian's family had carved around her eyes were completely gone, smoothed away by 12 months of absolute freedom and purpose. She looked up and caught me watching her, asking with a smile if the bird was ready. I told her I thought so, adding that it might be the most perfect turkey we had ever roasted. She laid her knife down, walked over to me, and wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her head against my shoulder. She whispered a thank you, and when I joked to ask if it was for the turkey, she said it was for everything, for giving her a life and for giving her peace. I kissed the top of her head. Peace isn't something someone gives you, Clara, I told her softly. It's something you build for yourself. You built this. I just helped you clear the foundation. The sharp crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside announced our guests. My dogs began barking happily as they ran toward the door. These weren't intruders. They were our pack. I opened the door to find Chief Harrison standing on the porch, carrying a heavy crate of local apple cider. He wasn't wearing his uniform, dressed instead in a thick wool sweater that made him look more like a lumberjack than a law enforcement officer. Standing right beside him was Elena. For the first time since I had known her, she wasn't wearing a black business suit. She wore a long red dress, and the splash of color looked absolutely stunning on her. She held a cardboard pie box in her hands. Harrison boomed out a request to enter, his voice full of warmth and energy. I shook his hand, telling the sergeant he was clear to enter, but instructed him to leave the ranks at the door, because today I was just Arthur. Elena walked inside and handed me the box, noting it was a walnut pie she had baked herself. Before I could even ask, she smiled and said she hadn't used a culinary algorithm. She used her grandmother's old recipe. I let out a loud, hearty laugh that shook the rafters of the cabin, telling them to come inside where the food was hot and the room was warm. We gathered around the table. It wasn't the massive, cold mahogany table from the Sterling estate. It was a round oak table I had built with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. It was covered in scratches and looked incredibly old, but it was solid as a rock. There were no assigned seats, and there was no head of the table. We sat in a circle, completely equal on every single level. I brought out the turkey and set it right in the center of the table, the steam rising and carrying the rich scent of rosemary through the air. Clara poured the wine, filling our glasses with a Pinot Noir. It wasn't the most expensive bottle on the market, but it was an honest, full-bodied, beautiful wine. She filled Harrison's glass, then Elena's, and finally mine. I watched her hand. It was perfectly, completely steady. Exactly 1 year ago, a hand had held a glass just like this one, and that hand had turned a holiday celebration into a declaration of war. Richard had used a hot drink as a weapon to humiliate us, trying to burn away our dignity with scalding liquid. I raised my glass, the ruby red wine reflecting the warm glow of the fire. The chatter in the room died down, and everyone looked toward me. I looked at Harrison, the man who helped me bring corruption to justice. I looked at Elena, the woman who had personally dismantled our enemy's financial empire. And I looked at Clara, my daughter who had risen completely from the ashes. "To family," I said. "To family," they echoed in unison. Then I added a thought that had been burning in my mind all year. "To the people who understand that loyalty cannot be bought," I said. "Loyalty can only be earned." We took a drink together. Nobody threw wine at anyone else. Nobody threw out a passive-aggressive insult, and nobody checked their watch to rush away. Harrison tore off a turkey leg, letting out a groan of pure satisfaction, joking that if I ever opened a restaurant, he would resign as chief tomorrow, just to come wash dishes for me. Elna burst out laughing, a rare, beautiful sound. She was completely relaxed, the sharp edge of the ruthless shadow agent completely gone, replaced by the genuine warmth of a friend. We ate and drank for hours, telling stories and completely avoiding any business talk. We didn't mention the Sterling trial, and we didn't mention the prison sentences that had been handed down just last month. We didn't talk about how Julian had wept like a baby in front of the judge, or how pathetic Richard looked trying to bribe the jury. Those ghosts were completely gone, locked away inside concrete boxes where they belonged. Instead, we talked about the future. Clara talked about the new community centers the foundation was building. Harrison talked about his grandson's Little League team, and Elena talked about the first real vacation she was planning to take in 10 years. I leaned back in my chair, watching them, feeling my heart completely full. It was a different kind of fulfillment than the satisfaction of a completed mission. It felt like a walled garden that had survived a long, brutal winter, finally blooming into full color. As the night grew late and the fire settled into a soft, glowing red ember, I excused myself from the table. I walked over to the mantel above the fireplace, where a simple silver frame held a photograph. It was Martha. She was smiling in the picture, her hair tossed around by the wind. The photo had been taken on this exact property 40 years ago, back when we had 0 money and 0 power. I brushed my finger against the glass of the frame. "We did it, Martha," I whispered softly. "Our girl is safe. The wolves have all been driven away." I felt a presence step up beside me. It was Clara, placing her hand gently on my back. "She would have absolutely loved tonight," she said softly. "She's right here," I said, patting my chest. "She never left." I turned away from the photograph and walked over to the wooden desk in the corner of the room. Sitting on the waxed wood was the black satellite phone, the brick, the terminal that connected me to a dark world, the device I had used to dismantle an entire empire, the device Elena used to call the Hand of God. It was blinking with a slow, steady green light, indicating it was on standby, waiting for the next crisis, waiting for the next war. I looked at it, realizing I had kept it right by my side for an entire year. I had spent 12 months sleeping with one eye open, waiting for retaliation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. 评估完这一切，我明白大局已定. The Sterlings were completely finished. Their assets were seized, and their allies had long since scattered. But more importantly, I had changed. I looked back over at the dinner table. Harrison was using a coin to perform a magic trick for Elena, and they were laughing loudly. I didn't need to be the colonel anymore. I didn't need to be the cleanup man. I picked up the phone. It felt incredibly heavy in my hand, weighted down by a lifetime of secrets and the raw power it held. I pressed the power button on the side. A prompt popped up on the small screen, asking for confirmation to power down. I looked back at my daughter. She was happy. She was powerful. She didn't need a bodyguard anymore. She just needed a father. I pressed the button for yes. The green light flickered once and went completely dead. The screen faded to a solid black, and the link was permanently severed. I pulled open the desk drawer, tossed the phone inside, and slid it shut with a firm click. It was officially over. I turned back to face the room. "Who wants coffee?" I asked. "I do," Elena said, raising her hand, "but only if I can have another slice of that pie." I smiled and walked back to the table, taking my seat among them. I was just an ordinary old man in a flannel shirt, sitting inside a log cabin in the woods with his family. And after a very long time, for the first time in my life, I knew that was more than enough. My name is Arthur Vance, and I am finally completely home. This experience taught me that true power never roars. It only whispers in the dark. I learned that respect isn't an inheritance you can get for nothing. It's a debt you have to pay back every single day with your actual actions. Richard and Julian believed their wealth made them invincible, but they forgot that the most dangerous man in the room is always the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. True family isn't defined by bloodlines or last names. It's defined by the people who choose to stay right by your side when the lights go out and the heat stops working. It's defined by loyalty, honor, and the courage to do what's right, even when you're completely alone. Never mistake silence for weakness, because sometimes silence is just the sound of a bear trap being slowly pulled open. Justice might be delayed, but when it finally arrives, it hits like thunder. Stay strong, stay humble, and always watch your back.